Okay, hello. It's very intense, isn't it? For that, I need
Yeah, you
to
know,
make
everything that
that.
happens after that intro is a letdown automatically, just so you know.
So
Very Doctor Who-esque, is what the vibe I was getting from it.
it is. I need to. What I think I need to do, and I will probably never get round to it, is sort of figure out a way to make the music fade out, but then the kind of image stay on while the music fades out. So then it is a bit more natural instead of it just being super
Cool.
intense, then cut off. But yeah, I'm not that advanced with my videography and audio and all that stuff. I just want stuff to work. Anyway, so today I'm talking to Richard Brown, who's got a YouTube channel of his own, but he's an actual philosopher, not just a philosophy hobbyist. Where I guess you predominantly talk about philosophy of mind over there, but sometimes some other things, and also you there's not many people who are professional philosophers, but also kind of engage with a lot of the people who debate in this space online and stuff like that as well. So I think that that's something interesting that you do. And so I guess the first kind of question I had for you was, I saw a video you did on World Philosophy Day where you were talking about your approach to philosophy, kind of collaboration versus combativeness, and also how, like your perspective on what you see going on in sort of online public philosophy. And so I was wondering if you could just open by talking about what your kind of view is of the way that philosophy should be done, disagreement should be handled, and so on.
Cool. So you're the one who watched that video. Okay. Uh, by the way, you didn't even notice that I went out of my way to wear that tie, which was in the picture that you put up. And this is the tie. Which, by the way, that picture you found was, I don't know how you found it online, but that's from like 12 years ago. So I was like, whoa, I wasn't as great back then. But
it was the best one of you I could find. I should have asked.
That's the best one. Okay. So anyway, I still have the tie. Yeah, it's interesting because obviously when you're talking about this sort of stuff, um, one doesn't mean to hold oneself up as always a champion, as living up to these standards. So I don't like want to come off as being, oh, this, look at me, how I've always behaved. Because actually that's not the case. And anyone who's ever known me can, and you can even find this online, but even before online as well, that this is not the way that I've always interacted. I used to enjoy, like, not enjoy, but also like couldn't resist, I guess I would say, a kind of, combative argument engagement style. And it was like, thrilling in a sense, like a chess game, but one where there could be a fight. So I just think that while that while that feels very satisfying from the first person point of view, um, it's not productive at all, and it doesn't really lend itself to an engagement with getting to the bottom of things, and this, to getting at the truth. But this is honestly something, I'll put my glasses on now. I only didn't wear the glasses because the picture I wasn't wearing glasses. I was so young back then. But I think that this is something I've really been conflicted about, and I've seen you discuss things related to this. It's not something I really talk about or think about publicly a lot, but it has to do with like issues about wokeism and deplatforming and those sorts of things, which I think are in the same sort of ballpark, because I think that in this kind of aggressive style of like making the other person look like an idiot, or undermining their position, that is a way of like epistemically deplatforming them. It's not like booing them off the stage, so to speak, but it is a way of like well,
like
doing some kind of,
delegitimizing,
yeah, exactly. So anyway, so I think that stuff carries some merit, and a lot of, and I grew up where that was like how people I knew interacted with each other anyway. It's like, so I get that, someone was just saying this on my channel recently when I was like criticizing Bernardo for being this way. They were saying, this is just how regular people talk. Like, this is just like bro talk. Like, this is just like, hey, fucking dude, like, what's up, bro? And I was like, well, yeah, that is kind of true. But, you can also do that I've taken the view seriously. Like, yeah, so I think it's it's one thing to kind of be, because I do believe, by the way, I'm getting really distracted already, but I do believe that like these normative claims about certain mannerisms or discourse or language are all real class patrol stuff. So like when people tell me not to swear, I'm like, why the fuck not? Like this is how people I hang out with speak. And if you think that's inappropriate, something that says more about like where you come from in your background. Because like people I know, when they like something, they say they fuck with it. Like I fuck with that. So it doesn't sound like a bad thing to me at all. So anyway, so I think that those things, we have to be sort of aware of all that stuff. So some people engage in that way, and yeah, but also there's the seriousness of engaging with the argument and positions in a credible sort of way. Anyway, so I'm getting way off of your initial question, but the initial point that I'm trying to make is that when I think about how we ought to do philosophy, I think about it from a kind of two positions. One is like for me as a person, and then the other is like as a discipline. So for me as a person, I'm think Socrates kind of had it right, that the kind of benefit of philosophy is knowing that you don't know, and then that's, you know, and rather an important and profound thing that you could you know, unpack or talk about. But as far as like a discipline is concerned, I think the job of philosophy is to try to map out a kind of conceptual space of and the argument structure that relates between them. And so when I'm trying to figure out like what I'm I think in the best case scenario, trying to think of the person I'm speaking with as a better, more informed version of me. And I want to say this to them. It's like if I'm arguing with myself in my room, reading the book, and I stop and say, how would Socrates respond to this or whatever? It's kind of like that, but then you're there. So I can say it to you, and then you can come back, and then, you know, I might change my mind or whatever. So oftentimes I will like present positions, not because I agree with them, but because I want to hear the response. Which led to, you know, me doing the Consciousness Live, these kind of interviews, because I am curious in finding out why people who are smarter than me arrive at positions that are not mine. So I do think that it's important to recognize that, you know, lots of people are smart. We're all like probably not unsmart. We're all smart, all of us. So if someone disagrees with me, then, well, okay, given that this background assumption, they must either start from different assumptions or different interpretations of the data that we both have. And so my interest is in kind of mapping out those things and say, if you start here, then where can you go? So I see it as a more collaborative effort, even when there's kind of spirited debate. I'm seeing it as, okay, should I adjust these views that I have, or is this link that I thought was there between these two things really that way or not? So in the public sphere, you know, I do think that there is a kind of real hunger to talk about these kinds of issues. Like people do want to talk about this stuff. People paint philosophy as this ivory tower enterprise, but I'm not from the ivory tower. That's not where I came from. But this is like stuff that's occupied me my whole life, and the people that I have interacted with, I think that people want to know the answers to these questions, and that's why I make a big deal out of this video I have. What is philosophy? It's like philosophy is according to the way I think of it, it's not really like a set of answers to questions, or it's not even a collection of distinctive questions themselves, because I think these are kind of just human questions. But philosophy is like a commitment to a certain approach to these kinds of questions. So anyway, that's the way I think about these things. I don't know if that was at all what you were intending to bring up.
No, it's very good actually, because I enjoyed listening to that video of yours, because I think that often, particularly academics, perhaps have a kind of idealized view of like philosophical discourse, right? And there's a sense in which like that's good, and that, you know, the idea of debating just ideas and it being about exchanging reasons or something like that, and I agree that that has a role and a place in it. But then there's also a sense in which some of that stuff can be performative, you know, like the idea of who gets platformed, right, can be like, well, I'm going to legitimize someone who's like a softball version of a view that I disagree with, but make them look really good, and then that presents. So there's all these different like aspects and elements to public facing debate and philosophy and discourse that kind of come in. And then also, you know, if people do engage in underhanded things like trying to delegitimize you in some way, or playing a bit outside the game of I'm just exchanging reasons with you, you know, where you want to be able to have a bit of an ability to bite back at that or something like that. So I thought the things that you were saying in that video about, you know, the two sides of like the collaborative side, the competitive side, well, yeah, like the collaborative is great, but you almost need a bunch of things in order to trust people in the first place, and you want to be able to do the combative side if you're going to come across dicks, and basically was the way I interpreted what you were saying. I thought that was good.
Yeah, and I don't always live up to that, by the way, because I get sucked into this. Like, I want to own the libs as much as anyone else. I mean, I am a lib, so I want to own myself as much as anyone else. But it's like, you know, I mean, I don't know. I think of it as kind of as akin to like martial arts. So when I was young, I knew a guy who was very deep into martial arts. He was like a black belt, and he was very, very much that was his whole way of thinking and way of life. And he always kind of would say things like, you know, if you ever have to fight someone, then they've already won, because they've caused you to like lose control of yourself, basically. If you know, you can deflect and you can protect yourself and those sorts of things, but if you ever really try to hurt someone, then in a sense that's a loss on your part. And I always thought, at the time I was like, yeah, bro. But that's actually pretty right on in a way. And there is this sense when you go into these debate rooms, when someone starts talking that way, well, if you engage back at that same level, then in a sense, I view it as a loss of control. And that's why I always say I don't really like arguing. Like, I like thinking about these things, and I like thinking through the issues and discussing them. But when it comes to arguing, like I feel compelled to, like, I'm probably like a reply guy or something like that. I just, like, you know, there's something wrong on the internet. I have to fight that like constant urge to be like, no, it's less way. So that's, I feel like, a shortcoming in my own self that I don't want to amplify. And like when I was first being drawn into these discussions on Discord and stuff, I felt that side of me being activated. And I don't enjoy it. Like afterwards, I always feel like, you know, it's like when you're trying to, you know, be healthy and or good or something, and then like you eat out, you eat a bunch of candy or something, and then afterwards, like, you don't feel great. Like, you feel like, that's how I feel afterwards. Like, yeah, okay, even if other people are like, oh, you were really this or that. It's like, I feel like I would like to hear what the other person said rather than me ranting and raving. And so anyway, I don't enjoy that. And I look back on some previous videos that I can find of myself and thinking like, gee, I was kind of missing the point that the person was saying, and I was too like flustered. So obviously no one's perfect, and I'm not saying that anyone should live up to this perfect standard or anything. I'm just thinking that this is a kind of thing to strive for, and that I, over time, myself personally, have tried to aim more towards, and to try and encourage that more online as well. And that doesn't mean like everyone has to be polite, and I'm not trying to talk about toxic niceness, which I think could be a thing, actually, you know. So I'm not people can say like, what the fuck are you talking about? I don't think that's a mean thing to say. So it's rather like, are we taking these ideas seriously in a serious way, and whatever you interpret that to be, and then people have different standards for what serious is and so forth and so on. So yeah, that I'm much more interested in that, even though I tune into the dumpster fires just as much as everyone else. And I remember when I was a grad student, like, you know, when Dennett would debate somebody on, is there a God? I'd be like, yeah, get him, Dennett. But then like he would be like dismissive of someone, be like, oh, that's just like the spaghetti monster. I'd be like, there's more to the point there that they're making. Like, you could actually engage them. It'd be more convincing if you'd actually talk about whether, and then that's when like the new atheism and that stuff was really it started to become more aware to me that this is not productive. And then gradually over time, I realized that, gee, if we're really like serious about this, this isn't the way we should be doing things. Um, Even though I agree, like largely with what the side may be saying, I don't think I always like have been supportive of like the way in which those things are done.
Cool. So yeah, that just wanted to ask about that at the start, so people could kind of get a feel of your perspective as someone who's involved in like academic philosophy and also engages online, of like, you know, the virtues and things that are involved. So, but the main thing that I want to talk to you about as well is philosophy of mind, of course, which is what you talk about on your channel so often. So I wondered if you could give a sort of autobiography, right, of the history of your thinking with respect to philosophy of mind. If you can remember, you know, like, have you had various different positions and things that have changed your mind over time? You know, how did your kind of thinking on these things go from your point of view?
Interesting. You know, okay, yeah. I have a question for you too at some point, because I saw your video on the knowledge argument.
Okay.
I have
Yeah,
I
sure.
wanted to ask you about that. But you know, I was kind of I don't know if you like want the whole history, but I'm old, so you know, I've been around
Yes,
for
there's
a
a long
while, and
history.
yes, it's a long history, exactly. But I'm kind of a non-traditional student, so I started at a community college uh, when I was 24, 25, something like that. Even though I had graduated from high school when I was 17, at the time that I was in high school, I was in a group home. I had run away from home and stolen a motorcycle. I was raised in a very religious, strict household. And at a certain point, when they were forcing me to, well, it's a long story, but anyway, so I was either baptized or get out. And I was like, please, then. So I ran away. And I was arrested, put in juvenile hall, group homes, and released when I was 18. Then kind of worked in fast food. Basically, I worked at McDonald's and Burger King and these other sorts of places in various odds and ends here and there, until finally I found out that because I had been in a group home, I was eligible for some program that would allow me to enroll in the local community college. And then they would also give me money for books. And I'd always loved reading. And I was like, okay, like free books basically. So, and I had, by that time, you know, I was 24 or 25, and I had been out of the group home slash graduated from high school for, you know, 6 years already. So that's kind of a long time when you're young. And I hadn't thought about school in a long time. I didn't think about this. I was trying to be a drummer, and I was playing in a death metal band. So yeah, life was going well, as you can see, working at McDonald's and playing a death metal. Actually, it wasn't bad. I recommend it. So anyway, uh, and I went to school to this community college in California, and I did. I mean, it's funny when I look back on it, because I'm like, why didn't I take a class in music? Like, I was trying to be a musician, but it didn't even occur to me to like think of that you could study music at school. So I just took like the gen ed classes and that they required, and one of them was a philosophy class. So and there were other ones too. So there was like algebra and chemistry and Western civil or whatever. So it was just kind of your general stuff. And in the philosophy class, I don't know, it was one of those moments where I was like, whoa. Um, I didn't know that people took this stuff seriously, because in my house where I came from, this was frowned upon. And, you know, because I spent a lot of time arguing with religious persons who were trying to convince me of these things that I just found intuitively like not believable at all. I was kind of just like immediately struck by the what? I don't think so. And along many dimensions when I was exposed to the concept of God. So I've just kind of never intuitively found it plausible, and that caused all kinds of problems. So it turns out that, you know, a lot of the things that I learned later, I could see coming from, you know, that weren't on my mind at that time, like the problem of evil and the hiddenness of God and all these other sorts of things that people talk about. So and I teach philosophy of religion now, so it's interesting. But that's all I didn't know that I was doing philosophy back at my home, but I think in retrospect I was, by having these kinds of arguments. No one would have put it that way. My mom didn't graduate from high school, and my father didn't graduate from elementary school, as far as I know. So none of my family went to school. So I didn't know about college at all. It was like a whole new experience for me, this whole concept. So like I would read Descartes, and I remember it's kind of funny because I remember reading uh, the meditations, and the like first paragraph. He's like, I'm sitting in my nightgown by the fire, and I don't know what's real. Is this a dream? And I was like, holy shit, dude, is this guy on acid or like what the hell? Like this is like these are the kinds of conversations that my friends had when we were tripping balls on the beach. Like this is serious stuff. Like this isn't um, you know, this is people get paid to do this. So it was kind of eye-opening in a sense. I was like, wow, this is something I could picture myself doing. I was so naive, like completely didn't know what it meant to be a philosopher, didn't know what it meant to like professionally. I was just like, well, if this is what you could talk about, like what is real and stuff like that, this is like been on my mind since day one. So like, okay. Um, and that was a big eye-opening experience for me. And previous to that, I'd always thought of myself as like wanting to be learning more about physics, and dreamt of going to places like Caltech and studying relativity theory like that. When I was in high school, I was reading books on, well, relativity theory and the math behind it and trying to figure that stuff out. Because if someone had pointed out some philosophy to me, I probably would have read it and been like it was written before 1980. I don't care. So it was a real eye-opening experience. And so I immediately, like that day after the first class, went and declared philosophy as my major. And I've had the same major the same major, the same interest and focus ever since. So I went on to a 4-year college after that and got a bachelor's degree, then got a master's degree, and then transferred and got a PhD. Along the way, I got a master's in psychology and studied neuroscience and psychology as well. But it all kind of traces back to that moment when I was in that community college class, and I was like, whoa, these are the questions that I was always told it was wrong to ask. And that in fact, somehow asking them was like an affront to like God or something like that. And I was like, but these are like um, these are serious questions that people talk about. And not only that, but there's a history of this. Like this is thousands of years old that goes back. I was just blown away. I was one of these completely like ahistorical kids who had made it through all the way to high school with no understanding of like history, like at all. So it was just mind boggling to me that you could look back and see this long chain of discussion about these ideas. And I just instantly wanted to be a part of that discussion. I was like, so that's the audacity of, I would say a little bit of white privilege looking back on it. And that I just immediately saw myself as fitting in. I was like, yes, these guys are like the people I've been looking for. And now I can look back and say, well, coming from the neighborhood that I came from, there wasn't a lot of people that did look like me actually, but I knew people that, didn't look like me, who were just as smart as me, but I wonder if they could have made it like from where I did to here. And if they would have felt like they fit in the same way that I did. So I do recognize that as an element of like, I don't think it takes anything away from like how hard I fought to get there and like how hard I fought to get here. But I don't think that it's worth hiding or ignoring either, that's like a part of what happened was that I felt like, oh, this was a conversation that people like me are having. But at the time though, just to finish my long-winded, sorry.
No, don't worry. It's okay. It's all right. I was just going to, I think, prompt you with what you're about to say. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, at the time, I was pretty much like on board with Descartes. So I felt like, oh yeah, like dualism was clearly true. I thought the conceivability of my mind without my body was like, duh, obvious. And, myself personally being like a kid with asthma, who was raised as a vegetarian, but was also raised on welfare. So wasn't always nourished in exactly the way a vegetarian should be. So maybe wasn't as, healthy as I ought to have been. So a skinny or scrawny asthmatic kid, who was also like thought of themselves as smart, was good at chess, liked math. I could see why it was instantly appealing to me to like, oh yeah, I'm not my body. Like that's not me. This weak, frail thing that's like holding me back. So it felt like very much satisfying for me to think of myself as not that body. And I remember thinking about that. Yeah, I'm this intellect, this thing that understands, this reasoning thing that, yeah, has experiences and so forth and so on. But those are contingently related to the body. I thought that was very clear when I first read this stuff. I was like, yeah. And, you know, my own history, I've experimented with psychedelics. I've taken LSD, I've taken acid, these other things. And so I'd seen, you know, things, man. And it aligned with my sense that, wow, okay, like color inversions and quality inversions. Okay, so could we make sense of these things like physically, functionally being the same, but all the stuff being inverted? And, you know, it seemed to me very intuitively firm at the time. If I had thought about it. And by the way, as an aside, I was also working in a mortuary at this time, and living at that mortuary as well, and had some like my job was to collect the mortal remains of deceased persons and bring them to the mortuary. And there's a lot, you know, so we'd probably best not talk about that. But anyway, so it was very interesting that I was reading all this stuff, thinking about dualism, and also like on a daily basis, seeing dead bodies, basically. Um, and I was thinking of them as like furniture, like this, be respectful of the furniture. It's valuable, but like the person's not here anymore. Um, so that was kind of my naive view, and I thought it was pretty obvious from this conceivability stuff that the Descartes stuff kind of just knocked me over. I was like, yeah, duh. But I wasn't religious, as I was saying. I was also very much like a kind of a natural born atheist in a sense. I just couldn't see past the physicality of the world. So I guess I was a bit of a dualist, even though I didn't go around arguing about dualism or making a big deal about it. But I kind of remember that I was in my, so long story to get longer, I graduated from the community college and went to San Francisco for four-year college. I went to San Francisco State University, and I went there because it was in San Francisco, and that was it. I wanted to go there. I didn't know anything about the school, and I had a couple other options that I had applied to, but I just wanted to be an SF. So I went there, and I was really unprepared. It was in the middle of the .com stuff. I ended up becoming homeless. My car got towed. I ended up living in the Tenderloin, living in the like staying in the library in the on campus and in the 24-hour section of the library, like sleeping in there until they kicked me out, basically. So it was pretty rough, and I could have dropped out at that point. It would have been easy because I used all my financial aid money. I had nothing. I was like, it's a long story, but anyway. So I was there in SF, and I remember I was in this philosophy of mind class. And I was like, wow. I went there thinking I was going to like be interested in philosophy of language, because at the time I was like, how the hell do words have meaning? I was like so confusing. So I was like really interested in that. But I went to the philosophy of mind class, and my interest switched like instantly. I was like, whoa, this is the real stuff right here. And I remember having this discussion with all these other like students, and everyone was arguing about the mind, and like no one knew anything about the brain. And they were like, so we read something, and you know, it was in this Block anthology, the nature of, I have it back here, the nature of consciousness, philosophical debates. It had just come out. We were reading it, so
I think I know the one you mean, actually. Yeah, I think I've got that somewhere.
Exactly, that big fat one. So we were reading that, and we were really lucky that we had a professor who brought this book to us. And I didn't know that this class was a combined graduate student and undergraduate class. I had no idea about that. So a lot of the students I was arguing with were graduate students, and I thought they were just like me, undergrads, but I was older. So like, you know, I fit, they didn't, you know, so anyway, I didn't realize at all at the time that this was happening. I only kind of realized afterwards. But anyway, so I just kind of realized that no one knew anything about the brain. And because we were reading these papers, and then we'd ask these questions, and it would be like, no, we don't know the answer. But they're talking about the brain sort of like at this generic level, but they don't really know anything about it.
The brain's just kind of like one billiard ball hitting another. How can that give rise to consciousness? Yeah.
Exactly. And at this time there was this, well, functionalism was the dominant view, and they sort of thought, well, the instantiation, it doesn't matter. Like you study it at the box and arrow flow chart level, and who cares about what's happening down there? And then behaviorism had also been popular, and they're like, look, that's just internal wiring. What matters is the stimulus. So there's a lot of traditions in psychology and philosophy actually, which kind of said you don't need to know about the mind, the brain, to know about the mind. And it was very much like alive in the way people were doing philosophy. And I didn't know any of this, but I can see clearly the trends. But now I think. But anyway, so I was like, there are people that study the brain on this campus, and they're over there in that building. So I went over there. Well, first I looked at the program for the college or whatever bulletin, and I saw neuroscience psychology. So I just went over there, and I was like, look, I'm a philosopher or philosophy student, and I'm taking these classes, and I just like want to take this class. Like, can I take it? But I don't never had biology class. I don't know anything about biology. And they were like, you're going to fail this class, but if I don't recommend it, but go ahead. So I took like systems neuroscience and cellular neuroscience, which involved a fair bit of math, but I wasn't scared of math. I just didn't know a lot of the stuff. Like, it was amazing. I'd be in these classes and the teacher would ask a question and the whole class would respond in unison. They'd like, oh, so this is that kind of protein. So it has what structure? And they're like, I'm like, whoa. It was like, being at church where they know how to respond in a way you don't. I was like, holy shit. So I was way out of my league, but I started like thinking that it was important to know about the brain in order to talk about philosophy of mind. So I started taking these classes in psychology and neuroscience. And just one day I was walking from one of these classes to the other, and I was thinking about, I forget what exactly. I was thinking about mental causation, but there was something that triggered it. It was something like bodily that I experienced at that moment that caused me. I forget what it was. Let's just say that I felt thirsty or something and grabbed it. I don't know what it was, but it was something like that. And I started thinking, gee, look, okay, so here's this thing that just the mind just caused to happen, and my body responded in this way. And I was like, so how do you make sense of that? I don't. And as I was walking, I just realized it's the only way that I could think of that you could make sense of it was if the brain was the thing that was doing all the causing. And kind of just thought to myself, gee, that seems to me a good reason to think that that's what's there, really, that it's the brain.
I
And
think
it just kind
just
of dispelled dualism for me.
So I know you've not completed talking about your full kind of journey of intellectual development around the mind. So we'll talk more about where you went from there. But this is actually something that I commonly observe with people who take like non-natural or non-physical views of the mind, right, in general, is that often there has not been a kind of attempt to engage with a lot of like the neuroscience and stuff. And so a lot of what goes on in these like intuition type scenarios that are constructed is that they basically set up some kind of distinction between the physical and like consciousness as it's conceived, and there's some kind of the concept of consciousness is, you can say they've been maybe trained to think about it a certain way by philosophy of mind as well. And then it's like, well, if you actually spent a bit more time talking about some of the science where maybe they try and just work on some smaller problems with a bit better operationalized, questions than the ones, these like broad questions, then all of a sudden your intuitions become very, very different, right? About the nature of explanation, what fits what, and so like, and it's not necessarily this one thing where you're like, oh yeah, now but just gradually over time, your sort of intuitions and things change to the point you're like, oh, actually,
it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because in the class, in the neuroscience class, we're using the Nernst equation to calculate how certain neurons would respond in certain circumstances, and then studying how, like, a Crab's law, the pincher response of the crab. And when you look at it's not completely 100% understood, but it's pretty much understood in some level of detail. And when you look at what's going on there, it's like, where's the room for anything else to happen? That's to me the substance dualism stuff, at least from the Descartes version of it. I've just always felt like we would have seen by now something in the brain, some event call it N, which when we looked at it and say, why did that happen? We would just not find an answer. But every time we look, we do find an answer. We're like, okay, well, why did that happen? Oh, these ion channels opened. Why did that happen? Aha, because the voltage difference across the membrane was different. Why did that happen? Well, because there were more potassium ions that were flowing this way. And it's just every step of the way, there's a mechanistic answer to the question, why did that happen? And by the end, you have like the pinching of the claw. So now, I don't think that that rules out that we would ever possibly find something like that in the brain. And I always like, compare the electrical working of the brain that we have now with the way they used to think of it as like a hydraulic system in the year, 1,000 years ago. And they didn't know anything about the electrical activity of the brain. So, there always may be some new thing in the future that we discover how to measure, which was there always, but we can only now pick up on. And we can't rule that out, I don't think. But given what we do know now, and barring anything like that, then I think that it would be very surprising if we did find a kind of spontaneous occurrence in this way in the brain. But that's kind of the natural prediction of dualism, right? Of this kind of substance dualism, which is that some event in the mind causes something in the brain. And so the answer to what is the cause is that thing up there, and you can't find it in the physical stuff. And so when that occurred to me, like what actually, like here's this thing we were discussing, like it was a very concrete thing. Like here's this neuron connected to this fires in this way, it causes this change down there, and there you go. Okay, so obviously we're more complicated than that, but when you consider that, it doesn't seem like we have any evidence empirically for there being this kind of extra cause. So it seems like therefore, and then when you talk to philosophers about this, they say, well, what about overdetermination? And it's like, okay, but if the physical thing hadn't caused it, then the mental thing would have. And it's like, so there's all sorts of debate that ensues. That's not the end of the story. But at the time for me, it really made me start to think about something which has become a major theme of my work and something I always rant about, which is how it is that things can go from like seeming so clear and then learning something empirically and having that go click. And then making you wonder, gee, in all these other cases where things seem so clear, what empirical thing could I learn possibly, which might make me change that view? And so that really has become my, and now, I mean, I hadn't thought about it until you kind of brought this out, but I think that's kind of become a defining feature of the way I think about these things. Is I think no matter how certain we are from the first person point of view, there's always a question about what kind of empirical thing could we learn which might make us change our mind. And I think that goes all the way down almost as far as you can go. So
yeah, because
so in a way, yeah, I did change my mind, and that was the beginning of this idea that I had that, okay, we need to be less sure of ourselves, and we can't just go around saying intuition, therefore fuck you.
So,
which is a style of argument, by the way.
so where did your thinking kind of go from there then? Like with respect to the philosophy debate in philosophy of mind in particular, were there kind of any other key things that you found out, or key debates, whatever, that kind of really shaped what your views have become now? Or was that the main difference, and then since there it's been kind of like fleshing it out almost?
Yeah, I would say the other one is just like my encounter with Dennett, which was around the same time. I never met him personally. I've emailed him a few times, but never met him in person. I've been at the same conference as him in the same room, but anyway. So when I say encounter with Dennett, what I mean is his ideas in his writing. And I remember reading in this same class, by the way, this philosophy of mind class. I guess now that I'm thinking about it, there's one other thing I'll mention after this, but in the philosophy of mind class, we read Quine and Qualia and Time and the Observer, which are classic Dennett papers. Time and the Observer, he wrote with another guy, Kinsborn, I think is his name, but Quine and Qualia is all him. So I just found Dennett's views to be like at the time, I just thought they were ridiculous. I mean, I just thought, dude, who is this? You know, I probably would have been one of those guys like, I can't believe people get paid to do this
Consciousness explained. Consciousness explained away.
Yeah, zing, zing, ha, 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 zing. Yeah, exactly. And I was very much influenced by Searle at the time. I have to say, Searle was over there in the Bay Area. He was in Oakland, or Berkeley. And I never met him either, but I went to talks of his and I read his book, Consciousness Rediscovered, or whatever it was. And turns out he's a scumbag, and it's like really a fall of a hero in a way. I talked about this recently in a video, but I was like I didn't know him personally, but he was someone who I admired the way he did philosophy. I was like, down to earth, no bullshit. Like, this is like what I admired. His emphasis on biological naturalism and the brain. I was like, yeah, finally someone's making some sense around here. So I really like admired his views and his way of doing philosophy. And now I look back on it and I'm like, ew. So I recently rewatched one of these videos, and I think he's like, as I said in the video, he's the Bernardo of physicalism. He is like dismissive and condescending and character. So it's entertaining to watch though, and you know, and it was like it's supposed to be in that kind of talk. Anyway, so the thing that really annoyed me was this idea that consciousness isn't there or something. And in the Quine and Qualia paper, where quining means to get rid of something that's obviously there, it's an inside joke to deny the existence of something that's obviously there. So, you know, I just felt like it was a kind of verificationalism. At the time, that because I was very much an undergraduate, so I thought I was like, aha, verificationism bad. Okay.
Yeah. Can you verify that?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I still think his view is like, he's like, well, if you can't tell the difference between Gisborne and, or what is his Chase and Sanborn, the case of the coffee drinker who they both don't like the taste of a coffee they used to like, but in one it's the same taste, he just doesn't like that taste anymore, and in the other it's a different taste, which is than the previous taste, and that's the taste that they don't like. They would have liked the original taste, but it's this new taste they don't like. And so Dennett basically, his argument is you can't tell the difference between these two from the outside, from any functional test or whatever, so therefore there's not a real difference between them. And at the time I was just like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? Obviously in reality there's a real difference between these two options, and if we can't figure out a way to test it, then what are you're just going to go around saying it's not there? So I was very much like, what is this guy talking about? And now I realize it's a lot more complicated. I'm talking about an undergraduate who's completely unschooled in these things. But it really drew me into this, like, but consciousness is real, damn it, mode of discussion, which still very much is something I have to deal with, these illusionists and so forth. So, and I was in this undergraduate philosophy of mine, other class, modern philosophy class, reading Descartes, and the professor said, as one of our homework assignments, try to think of something Descartes never doubted. And I said, you know, he never doubted that he was conscious. Whereas this guy over here, Dennett, is over here doubting if he's fucking even phenomenally aware of anything. It like boggles my mind. So I was like, Descartes' doubt's not radical. Dennett's doubt is radical. That's radical doubt that I might be a zombie. Dennett says, you don't know if you're not a zombie. At the time, I was very much like, I don't know, I'm not a zombie in this incredulous, but have you taken acid sort of like and seen Santana play sort of way, you know? So it's not I think it's more complicated than that, obviously. But that was one of the things I still think is very much on my mind to this day. It's like, okay, physicalism, but phenomenal realism. Consciousness is real. And I don't like Mysterianism. I know you're going to talk about quietism with Pete coming up soon. I don't like that. I don't like illusionism. I don't like people who say we have to only talk about access consciousness. I don't like people who say, what do you mean by phenomenal consciousness? I just think all of these things are like ways of dodging the what I view as the primary explanatory target of the science of consciousness, this real feature of the world that actually exists and that I like have been thinking about my whole life, I feel like. So anyway, that's still very much a theme. And then finally, third is that I also at SF State, which, you know, I can't recommend it enough, these places where they're affordable it was like pennies on the dollar basically to go to school there. And looking back on how much it's amazing, these are people that were there dedicated to helping dumb shits like me come, because they said, oh, you know, at the time they were very much like, we love meeting students like you. And I was like me, I'm an asshole. But actually, you know, now I agree, I love meeting students like me, people that actually care about this stuff, that are intellectually curious, and that want to follow the argument, that want to go, where does the argument go, and not try to pick the conclusion first, and say, how do I get there? But actually map where the argument goes in as honest a way as you can. Anyway, so the third thing I would mention is that I discovered existentialism, and I read a lot of Sartre, and I had a kind of like very profound experience reading Being in Nothingness in the fog in San Francisco, which was a very being in nothingness kind of vibe about it. So like those ideas, I think still are in the background of my thinking, ideas about what a person is, what it means to be human, how that relates to transhumanism. I think that existentialism has something interesting to say about that, the idea that essence precedes existence, or existence precedes essence. You know, this, so I think there's interesting things there. And I also, you know, like to think about Sartre as this weird guy doing methamphetamines in the French Revolution. So, you know, it's those themes. I don't write professionally about existentialism, and I'm kind of just an amateur, but I do think that when push comes to shove, a lot of things that I tend to say can be traced back to thinking about existentialism.
So then in terms of mapping out what your well-formed views are, right? So people can kind of have some idea of how you approach these things. I mean, maybe we could go through some of the kind of classical arguments or something one by one, but is there like a label that you would want to identify your view with, or like, you know, an overarching kind of metaphysical view that it sits quite firmly in, or something like that?
My view, I don't think so.
It's all right as well.
I guess, yeah. I guess my view could be called "Who the fuck knows-ism," or "This shit is hard-ism." So I really think it's difficult, and I don't. My considered view is that physicalism hasn't been shown to be false, but we don't know if it's true. And I don't think these other views have been shown to be false either, but maybe there's less reason to think they're true, but maybe some reason to think they're true. So that if you laid out all of the possible ways the world and the mind might be, then I would say that I think that probably physicalism isn't false, or at least we don't know it. And that's what I defend the most often. And people think of me as a physicalist. And, you know, I've written papers and people accuse me of being that physicalist motherfucker. And I was like, okay. So I'm friendly to physicalism. I think it's not known to be false. I don't think a priori arguments show to be false. But I don't think we know that it's true. So I think that's an important distinction. So maybe this is just kind of agnosticism generally across the board.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I was going to say, would you be happy with that kind of label for the view, like a philosophy of mind agnostic or something almost, but with a sympathy to
directed agnostic, though, because I'm not like a Russellian teacup agnostic. I mean, in the philosophy of religion, I think of myself as an agnostic as well, but not like the Russellian agnostic, because I don't think it's equally likely that there's a Zeus. So I think there's some evidence. I saw some discussion of yours about this recently. Some evidence for a designer or creator of some sort. Depending on what you mean for by evidence, maybe some evidence for something more than that, but that depends a lot on what you mean by evidence. But generally, I would sum up my views there as like, it's more likely that we're living in a simulation than that any of the known religions are true. And that all of the traditional arguments for God's existence, except the ontological argument, better support the simulation hypothesis. So but I'm still like officially agnostic on whether there is some kind of designer, or whether it's a simulation or something else. But I'm definitely not agnostic about like the God of the Bible, the God of the Torah, the God of the Quran. I'm pretty much an atheist about those guys. Zeus as well. So, but this more general abstract category of is there a designer and what are the attributes of any of that thing? I'm kind of a traditional agnostic in that sense. Although I think there's evidence on both sides, so not really a traditional evidence. I agnostic. I think kind of it really personal preference is going to be the only swaying difference there.
Well, there was actually a debate that I hosted between a guy called Joe Schmid, who you might know, and James Fodor, my co-host, on talking about, you know, like how should we consider kind of agnosticism and atheism, because I think some people make a very kind of strict case for the way that, you know, something like agnosticism should be considered. So people say, you know, I mean it in this sense or that sense, but I think there's a lot of different ways in which one can kind of be an agnostic. You know, there's a general idea of undecidedness one way or another, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean like I'm 50-50. It might mean I think there's just not enough justification. I should withhold my judgment in some way, or I recognize the complexity of this field and I just can't.
Well, I would say it differently. I would say that given my personal nature and background, that I have kind of pessimistic take on the evidence. But I could see how someone with a less pessimistic nature, a background, like, you know, for me, I don't know. People say everything happens for a reason. I immediately think of all the animals that are slaughtered for eating, all the torture, and, you know, and I'm just like, really, everything happens for a reason, like pat, pat, pat. So like that's because I've had a lot of bad experiences in my life, but a lot of people haven't. So maybe they're thinking, so maybe it's just my nature, my own personal experience that's biasing me. That's kind of the source of my agnostic. Maybe if I were like a better person, I'd be more convinced by these arguments, is sort of, or a different kind of person, in other words. And less pessimistic, just generally speaking, because I can't even really bring myself to take seriously the idea of a loving being creating all of this and then it being like this. Like I just can't. Like it just short circuits my mind. Like my brain just like haywires when I'm like, wait, so all loving, all powerful in this, like, and then you could do backflips and try to explain that away. But I just think
that's just a no-see-him. That's just a no-see-him inference. Just because you don't see God's reasons, you're
exactly. So that's what I mean. Maybe if I was less pessimistic, but I read Dostoevsky and I was like, yes, this is what I'm talking about. Like if one child suffers, I was like, no, if I stub my toe, like that's enough. That the toe hurts so bad. But cancer doesn't. Like this is already a design flaw already. Like this is enough. And you know, not to get distracted, but you know, and then people talk about free will a lot, but I've always had the response that there's lots of things we can't do, but it doesn't mean we're not free. So when I was younger, I wanted to be able to jump to the moon. I really wanted to. Like this is not a joke. Like I had the desire to be able to jump to the moon. And I will never be able to do that. I felt very frustrated. And people are like, it's just not possible. And I was like, why the fuck can't I do this? I want to. So, okay, I don't see why evil couldn't have been like that. Like something maybe just really bad they wanted to do, but just wasn't physically possible. So I've never seen a good response to that way of arguing against.
The way I think of that one as well, and it's obviously there's a slightly different sense of freedom at play, right? But it's kind of like, you know, if you kind of sign up to the idea that, say, people who commit certain crimes should be put in prison or something, you know, you kind of agree to limiting their freedom in some ways. You don't think their ability to be free is just so valuable that it justifies letting them, you know, go on to commit murders or rob or whatever it is that they were doing. And now you know I can see how you can make it work still and say, well, that, you know, there I mean freedom in the sense that their powers allow versus, you know, freedom in the libertarian sense, which is the ability to do other but and then the stuff.
Well, I think even if you allow the libertarian sense in that God should have made the world where people only libertarian freely choose to do what's right. And to say that he couldn't have is like already a kind of a weird thing to say. But anyway, so I don't want to get. I mean, if you want to talk about that stuff, I'm happy to. It's sort of not related to the philosophy of mind stuff, but I do have views in this area. So you know. So
there was a question though. A question then about your characterization of your own view on mind is just how would you understand physicalism as well? Because obviously there's a lot of different ways that people can understand what that means? Is there one particular one that, when you say you're sympathetic to physicalism, or your views are sympathetic, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to answer that question is that, well, there's a lot of ways to be a physicalist. Some versions of physicalism we already know are false. This is something that Daniel Stoljar points out a lot. By the way, before I go down this rabbit hole, I want to mention that I do know who Joe Schmidt is.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
I have seen James, you and James talking.
Yeah.
And I think I read a paper of Joe's recently on the Grim Reaper paradox, which I thought was very interesting and fascinating, on forward-looking Grim Reaper paradoxes. Which he got, he's a very smart guy, and he's been publishing papers, putting us all to shame, publishing papers as undergrad before he was even a grad.
Yeah, it's like a 12-year-old.
Yeah, exactly. So no, that paper is extremely fascinating, interesting, and I have all kinds of things to say about Grim Reaper paradoxes as well. But anyway, so I really respect the work he's doing, even though I don't always agree with everything he says. But I agree with most of it. So I forgot what.
Physicalism.
Yes, physicalism. Yeah. So like one version of physicalism was from Democritus. Democritus, these guys, like the ancient Greeks, they had every variety of view that you could imagine. I mean, Democritus, the ancient atomism, thought that the basic building blocks of stuff was just little like solid bits of matter. So, and the only difference between the ones he assigned to perception, or the soul, the mind, and the ones out there were the shape. Like they had a kind of not spherical, but crescent shape, whereas all the other ones were more angular. And so, according to him, and of course, according to him, they had every variety of shapes, because the principle of sufficient reason. Why would they only have some shapes versus others? So the principle of sufficient reason suggests atoms have every possible shape. So one possible shape they would have is this kind of crescent shape. That's the one that gives us the ability to sense and perceive. He thought ghosts were just these bits of atoms without the atoms corresponding to the body. They were these just the mind atoms or something like that. He thought maybe even the gods, like the Zeus and these guys, might be physical, like made of these atoms things. So Democritus was like, that's physicalism, dude. Just shape. Like that's the only difference between. So that's pretty hardcore physicalism. I'd say we know that kind of materialism is false, because the world isn't like that. As a matter of fact, as a matter of empirical discovery, Democritus's views are not true. So if what you mean by physicalism is that there are little bits of material that are distinguished by their geometrical shapes, then that's clearly not the case. So obviously the word physical has gone through many transformations, and that's why people, modern persons, contemporary, I mean, prefer physicalism to materialism. Often it is the case that they want to distinguish themselves from this older view that the world is material. And the modern view is that, well, it's not. There may be matter, but it's fields. It's matter and fields. And maybe matter is a kind of field, actually. So maybe it's just fields. So it's certainly whatever those guys were talking about doesn't seem to be like the way, or at least if our physics is right, it could be wrong in the long run. We have some reasons to think it's not complete and all that stuff. So obviously, but given what we know now, many modern physicalists use that term because we don't think of the base level of reality as being little bits of stuff with shape. It's something else. So what else is it then? Well, you could go different. And this is what you were asking. Like, what do you mean by? And I guess you're asking what I mean. But what I think is that it's complicated. So you have to go through all these options. So you could say, well, what's physical is what's mathematizable. And I think that's roughly, largely the way people use it. So to put it more in terms of the debate in philosophy of mind, it's what entails structure and function. So structure is like what the thing is built out of, and function is what it does. And hopefully you'd be able to mathematically describe these things. And so if you look back at Descartes, this is one way that he's characterizing the difference. I mean, he puts it in terms of extension. Things would take up space, so maybe we'd quibble about that. But actually, I don't know. you know, one of the reasons I've always been interested in string theory is because they start with strings, which are one-dimensional objects. And I always thought it was weird that physics starts with point particles, which have no dimensions. And then we're supposed to say the world around us is made of dimensionless points. Like, that's weird. So at least string theory starts with something with a dimension. It's only one-dimensional, but it's a dimension. So you don't get such a weird leap from none to some. Whether that means it's true or not, I don't know, but that's intuitively one of the things that I always, and I was one of these guys who found out about string theory like when I was in high school, and I was like very interested in this stuff way back then. So I've been following this for a long time. But anyway, so you could mean like what's mathematizable. And when people like, I'm kind of like I have some level of credence, belief, whatever, in ontic structural realism. Which basically says what's real, what's physical is just the structure of the stuff. And what that is what's the mathematical. So when Newton changes to Einstein, what's the same there is all the equations. So Newton's theory doesn't get falsified. It just becomes a special case of the more inclusive theory. But those equations are, so the structure is preserved. And by structure, we mean the mathematically formalizable relations that we're talking about. Like the relationships between F and force and mass and acceleration and so forth. Okay, so those things are all preserved. And so that's probably, maybe you could mean that by, and the ontic structural realist think you have to kind of take lessons from various physics and conclude that that's what the base nature of physical reality is. So I take that seriously. On the other hand, in my less demanding moods, I think, look, by physical, we just mean it's not mental. So I actually technically don't even really care what the base level of reality is, as long as it's not like Philip Goff says it is, and that you don't have to talk about phenomenal consciousness or awareness or what it's likeness or any of these other, what I take to be psychological features of human beings and other animals. And if those features are at the base level of reality, then okay, you know, what you call it, whatever you want, it's not what I want to preserve or what I'm thinking of as physicalism. So in some sense, I think, yeah, all these debates, you could try to get, and people try to say, we can't even say what it is. In a sense, yeah, maybe you're right. But this is the via negativa, the negative way of saying what the physical is. That's just that which is not mental. And part of me is fine with that. So what if I would be happy if like this was all a computer simulation, but at the base level, it was just something physically that was simulating us. I would still say physicalism is true, even if like we live in some upper level of the reality. So in a way that I could even go as far as saying that which is physical is the common sense thing that we're talking about, the stuff that we can touch and taste and smell. And in that way of thinking, then whatever consciousness is, it shouldn't be any different than water. So if you do that though, then it kind of loses meaning altogether. And you're like, okay, so you could be an idealist and be a physicalist in some sense. And like, yeah.
Well, this was something I was going to ask actually, was do you think that view of physicalism, obviously like Kastrup describes himself as like a naturalist, for example, and I know you might want to distinguish between naturalism and physicalism, but I kind of find that a bit odd, at least, because I would have thought that maybe the role of a word like naturalism is almost to do something like exclude views like Kastrup's. You know, it seems like rather than it being some.
But what about views like Chalmers?
Less clear, I suppose, and even Goff's I kind of struggle to understand, because it seems like he's almost proposing a revision of physics in a way to be inclusive of a particular property. So it's like it seems more physics-like in a way where I'd be like, I'm not sure I'd exclude that from like naturalism, but there's some elements to it that seem a little bit unlike naturalism because they're a bit spooky or something.
Yeah. I think, I mean, these words have a long history, obviously, and people have used them in all sorts of ways. So naturalism and empiricism are words that get thrown around. But so, you know, I once was out standing at a bar, actually, and David Chalmers was next to me. And some like young graduate student came up and they said, oh, hey, you're David Chalmers. I've heard about you, but I don't know anything about you. What's your view about consciousness? And he like, Chalmers was there, and he like looked at me and he was like, ask this guy. And I was like, he doesn't think consciousness can be explained by science. And Chalmers was like, no, that's wrong. I don't think it can be explained by physical science. But I do think that there is a scientific or a science of consciousness, and that it's a mistake to say of me, David Chalmers, that I don't think that consciousness can be explained by science. Rather, it is that I, David Chalmers, think that science has to be expanded to include consciousness as a fundamental element in something like the way that fields were included as a fundamental element, so that they didn't become explainable by science. They become the things in terms of which you offer explanations in science, because they're introduced at the fundamental level. So that was a long time ago. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think this is relevant to your question, which is why these guys want to be called naturalists. It's that they want to associate themselves with science. They want to say, look, we can do science. We're not anti-science. Chalmers is all for the science of consciousness. He's done a lot of work, even you might think, in sort of helping the science of consciousness get started. People could disagree with that. I know people might be, there's a debate about, has this been harmful to the science of consciousness? It might be related to the IIT stuff, which has been going on, but so there's a debate there. But anyway, so I would say he's been helpful to the science of consciousness. Even though I don't agree with his views, I agree with the way a lot of the debate is set up. I think he has mapped out the conceptual space in a useful way, which I think has helped contribute to what I would call progress in philosophy, not towards truth, but towards mapping conceptual spaces. Naturalism, then, in that sense, is this idea that things are amendable to scientific study and explanation. And if you have to expand science, and so you don't want to, maybe that's going to be the case, but it's not getting rid of science, going beyond science, or saying that it's an expansion of the science. And so the idea that consciousness is part of the natural world, which could be in some sense incorporated into a scientific worldview, if you don't equate that with physical science, is the kind of view I think that David Chalmers is trying to defend, and why he spends time writing papers on quantum mechanics and dualism and these other sorts of things, where he's trying to say, look, how could it be part of the natural world? And the one that science is trying to talk about, do we have to expand what that means in some sense? Not like go beyond it. And so it's really, in my mind, I was equating it back then. I was equating science with physical science, and I think a lot of people do. And Chalmers's quest, in a sense, is to try to get people to open up their definition of science, to take consciousness seriously, and to include it in the things that science takes seriously, and then ask what would you get.
So within the sort of story about Chalmers there, and how that might change someone's view on the bounds of science, I do I'm definitely sympathetic, right, to what he says he's trying to do there. I think though, for me, and I don't know how exactly I draw this boundary, there is like a boundary between what, say, someone like Chalmers, or maybe Goff's a little bit more towards that border than I'd say Chalmers is, and then I'd say like Kastrup's definitely over that border for me in terms of like what I would consider actually trying to produce scientific explanations, rather than just completely almost like turn the world on its head into like a completely different conception of reality, where science doesn't mean, like providing these explanations that really explain the way the world is. I don't know the best way to articulate what I'm getting at there, but I'm like somewhere in between those. Like I'm like, maybe there are like psychological laws or economic laws or something like that, and they can only be a full or a better science, science that's more successful or fruitful would be one that appeals to these entities that aren't reducible or don't feature in, fundamental physics or something. But that, I'm willing to say science could go in that direction, but then it seems like the idea of, well, actually, everything's just kind of appearances and a panentheistic idealist God's mind or something like that is just too different to that attempt to maybe provide explanations of things like economics or psychology or something by appealing to, consciousness as like an entity that's not reducible. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would sort of disagree with that. So, Bernardo, say what you want about how he does philosophy. I think he is doing philosophy, and there is
philosophy for sure. Yeah, I mean the science. Sorry, I mean in terms of what I consider.
Yeah, but I was going to get to the science. Okay, so he's clearly doing philosophy. I think he takes himself as doing philosophy, but he also takes himself to trying to be fitting consciousness into the natural world. And he takes himself to be using things from science to help his like. I think his argument that relies on disassociation and that sort of stuff, whether you agree with it or not. And when we had our discussion, I tried to empirically challenge him on this and try to give a debunking argument of the disassociation stuff. And he was kind of, I thought, you could cleverly say that, but why think it? But I think it's a little more than that. But anyway, so, but still, he's appealing to things that science has. That some people think are scientific things, like that disassociation is a real thing, and that there could be like a mind which is split into altered disassociations. So in that sense, that's a natural process, disassociation, if it's real. I don't know to what extent it is.
Well, at least in this is kind of where I find there's a bit of a weird. Like a tension, at least in some of the things he says, right? Because it seems that I can understand why, in the case of like, say, corpus callosum surgery or something, why you might think there's like separate. But then my explanatory understanding there is like parasitic on appealing to like neural structures, whereas a global brain or a global mind, I can't like appeal to physical structures in order to explain its operation or dissociative identities or anything like that.
Well, that's right, but you could appeal to the concept of disassociation, which has some empirical support.
More like a psychological phenomena of something like that. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, and like I said, I'm a little bit skeptical of it. I mean, I've had disassociative experiences, but I don't know about full alters. And he's very impressed by this like fMRI study where a person had a blind alter, and in the case where she claimed to be in that alter, there was no fMRI activity in the visual area, but when she was in her sighted alter, there was. And so, people have tried to debunk that by saying it could be that she was averting her eyes in a subtle way when she was in that alter. And that's why you see the difference in it. So I think there's, still, but it is interesting if it's the case that a person who claims to be blind has this neural difference from the same person in a different case claiming to be sighted, and saying they have no memory of the other case and they don't know each other. So I don't know if that's a real thing, then you could see how he applies it, but I don't know. So if what you're trying to do is explain the world out there, and you really are impressed with this theory of perception, which he uses a lot, and I think all of it, people impressed by this use a lot too, this screen or dashboard or whatever the terminology that they use. If you start from there, then I do think that there is a point that they are making, which, I mean, Bernardo uses this argument where he says it's like a painter painting a self-portrait and then saying, I am the self-portrait. And obviously that's silly. The painter should be saying, I am what the self-portrait represents. So the difference between the Bernardo view of perception and I'd say the kind of Cogsci standard view of perception is in this screen of perception stuff. And whether the thing we perceive is the world itself, the stuff out there, or the stuff on the screen of perception. And that's an old debate in philosophy that goes back to idealists like Berkeley, and but even to non-idealists like Locke. But as soon as you get to that starting point, where you say, all I know is my own experience, and that's the only thing I really know, then I do think you have to ask this question, well, how do you get from there to the existence of something that's independent of your mind? Of course, the way out of that is to recognize the problem with the starting point. where we start is not with our own mind, but with the world. The world's out there. That's where we start. And we can have direct contact with the world, even if what we're doing is representing the world and in that direct contact. So I think what's called direct realism is not incompatible with representationalism. And that's been a move in philosophy of perception within the last 50 years or so, whatever. But anyway, so I think that, there are arguments back and forth between these two camps, but I think a lot of the appeal of idealism starts from this Cartesian enclosure of all I know is my experience. And then you do have to ask these questions. I do think it is positing something. I mean, this is what, Berkeley always said to Descartes. He was like, look, bro, I'm the real empiricist. Berkeley would say this, right? He was like, bro, I'm the real empiricist, Berkeley, because I'm only talking about what I can see, taste, touch, and smell. You, Descartes, are the weird guy who says there's something beyond what I can see, taste, touch, or smell, this weird invisible thing that I can never see, taste, touch, or smell, but was allegedly out there causing I see, taste, touching, and smelling. Like, what is this? Where's the evidence for it? And I do think, you do. And then Kant comes and gives this transcendental argument. Well, it's got to be something because experiences. So there's a big history of philosophy debate here. But the central idea is once you start from this theory of perception, you do have to make this extra step to what's outside of the perception. So I don't think that's, and I think they take that very seriously. So, what really is the evidence for anything physical outside the mind besides more experiences? They're really impressed by that.
I don't mean to be sort of accusing anyone of not believing what they say they believe, or like really being convinced of it. But I think there's something. I'll have to think about it more. I was trying to think what it is that I find doesn't kind of fit with at least the way I think of naturalism or something. I think maybe it's something like, so in the case of, say, like certain views of philosophy of mind that aren't reductionist views, they're still, science maintains its role as central to our epistemology, as like the best way of finding things out, of firmly seated in reality from top to bottom or something like that. Whereas it seems like maybe in Kastrup's view, science becomes, this thing that explains regularity and appearances on the screen or whatever, but actually the real reality is it's special in it's disconnect. Science could be, you could have appearances a bunch of different ways, different sciences, but the real reality isn't scientific. It's kind of a way, and I think that maybe that's why it doesn't quite sit right with me to consider it a natural, but maybe maybe that's
so just to press on that a little bit, do you think of like Copenhagen versions of quantum mechanics are the same? Because like those I take those seriously. Some people say the job of science is not to tell us about the fundamental nature of reality, but rather to answer questions that we ask. So every question we ask, we get the right answer, but what is this? This question of what the table is doing when we're not looking at it or measuring it, like what we can say is what's going to happen when we look at it. That's what science does. It tells you what you'll see when you look at it. It doesn't tell you anything. It's not supposed to. On this view, I'm not saying I really believe this. I'm just saying I take it serious. It's something to think about in this area where, so it's really a debate about what the role of science is. So it sounds like your view is that the job of science is to tell us about the fundamental nature of reality. And Kastrup is saying physical.
I think it's more an epistemic thing or something like that. It's like, it's like that something remains, something we develop methods and tools for exploring that thing that become a science, where then, it's like a legitimate body of knowledge and we can refine it and stuff. Whereas it seems instead what happens on Kastrup's view is like the opposite thing, where we lose our ability to scientifically inquire about this like consciousness or metaphysical space, and then it becomes, and then there's like a special way of knowing that's not, so whereas on Chalmers' view of something, I would think you get a better operationalized conception of what mind is, that okay, it's not reducible, but now I've got, like I've got psychological laws or something, and I have explanations and entities and things. It seems like the opposite thing happens on Kastrup's view, like all the science happens in the appearances, and the real, is like it is immune almost to that type of investigation. Something.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Kantianism, as I would see it. And that was the debate that Kant thought, was that he saw that Kant thought I'm not a Kant scholar, but I have to teach this stuff, so I have my own views on Kant. But so the debates, in a sense, between Berkeley and like Descartes and Locke, about whether there is anything beyond experience. So these guys all start from the same starting position. They're all like, okay, so all we know is for our own experience, Descartes, cogito ergo sum. So we're here, and then we have to say this could be a dream, this could be a whatever. It's okay, great. So we're hosed in that way. Where do we go from there? Descartes said, well, what's external to the mind is what we call physical reality. And Berkeley said, no, that makes no sense. Physical reality is the stuff that's in the mind that we bump into. It's this stuff that, right? It's everybody agrees that like this table, this computer, and this coffee cup are like in my mind. Like everybody, Descartes, Locke, and all those guys, they agree that this is something in my mind. So the only question is like, how do I believe there's something external to it? And so they're arguing about what the word physical should apply to. Yeah. Descartes says the word physical applies to that stuff that's outside of perception. And Berkeley is basically saying, no, the word physical applies to the stuff in perception. Yeah. And Kant comes along and says, gee, you guys are half both right. So yes, the physical stuff, the word physical applies to the things in our experience, but there's still something beyond our experience, which we can't say is physical. We can't say is any, so then you have to say, oh Lord, what the hell is it? But anyway, so the debate is like, what is science really in the job of doing? And of course, Kant's answer is it's in the job of predicting experiences. And that really, you can see that in the Copenhagen interpretation, that's kind of basically they're in line with that. And I think that Bernardo's in line with that too. That the job of science is to predict experiences we'll have, not to tell us about what's really there, but we have to use philosophy to get at that or something like that. And so if you, I mean, the thing about his view that I think is worth thinking about is that he starts with this idea that what we call physical is an abstraction. And then if you really think about that, what he's trying to say is kind of the stuff that I think we've just been talking about, which is that what we start with is, according to him, the experience. And then you do your Descartes thing and you go, so I could be having this experience when, there's no physical world at all. So what I think there's a physical world at all, what I have is this. So how do I get out of that? And then the physicalist says, well, so the idealist, the reason why there's all this rancor amongst them is because a lot of physicalists assume the physical world is there. And these guys are like, yeah, but you only know that by experience. As I said, I think there's a problem with that. Namely, they start with this theory of perception that has been debunked. But I think if you have that theory of perception, this is a pressing problem.
I think maybe there then what would make me more sympathetic to like Bernardo saying his views are naturalistic or something would be if he sort of helped me to understand what potential laws of the unity consciousness that sits behind it all might look, like is that something that would be the subject of study of basically like there'd be ways of finding out and constructing a science of that and maybe generating predictions of it.
I didn't come here to defend Bernardo.
I know. No. I just think you're doing a good job steel manning, but yeah.
But I think his view is that like neuroscience is that. So, when I asked him about this, I was like, look, what reason is there to think anything out there is mental? Like we have these laws, they work in this way. Like we never have to appeal to anything mental in the explanation of why physical thing out there causes physical thing over there. And he was like, that stuff that we're describing is in our experience and it's following these objective laws, but it like that neuroscience is uncovering. But that what we're actually observing is a law of like consciousness or mind. so that it's a little bit about finding out, like even finding out about trees growing, and his view is that all that stuff is consciousness. So every science is going to be doing what it does on his, as far as I understand, it's going to be doing just what it normally does, studying the things that it's studying. But the only thing that's going to be different is that it's trying to construct a theory of mind in an objective sense, or in the sense of, now you would say, no, it's a theory of physical things, and there's where the debate begins.
Like, well, I don't know if I would actually, like, honestly, like, I'm sympathetic to, I can step outside of my own view and kind of see that, like, where he's coming from. I think there are just these bits of it that I struggle to see how they kind of fit in, so then it's like, well, I can understand how you could appeal to the regularity of appearances, essentially, in terms of doing things to brains or neural structures, or coming across neural structures, and they seem to be accompanied by consciousnesses, things like that. But then I think the thing I struggle is like the two tiers. So it's like, well, that's in our experiential reality. Now I'm making sort of these inferences about metaphysical reality underneath, and then I'm like, well, what does from the base level of unity of ultimate experience, that of that experiential point of view, what's the relevance of these explanatory roles that make appeal to neurons and things? And if there isn't a relevance between the two tiers, then in what sense is this explanation an explanation that helps us to understand, what's going on at that level as well? And so that creates, so then, and I'm saying,
I think that's an important point, because it's, in my view, what you're getting on is that there's a similar explanatory gap or conceptual distance between, like, knowing the things we know and knowing what the ultimate mind is doing or whatever, which it seems like you should be able to predict if you really have the views that Kastrup has. So I think that you're right, but so my only claim here is that idealism is not ridiculous. It follows kind of straightforwardly from a certain starting point, which aligns with the thing I was talking about earlier, which I'm interested in mapping these areas out. So I do think that if you start from that theory of perception and follow this traditional path, that it becomes very difficult to work your way out of it. And that idealism is a solution or a way of trying to work your way out of it. But so I want to get off the boat way earlier when we feel so confident about these a priori arguments, because really when you read the stuff that Kastrup has, it's just like, it starts from the hard problem, like hard problem, obvious, duh, so what next? And I think it's interesting to look at what's next, if anything. But if someone ever challenged me on like why do you start from the hard problem and move like to we need to do this, then I think that's where the issues begin. But once you are convinced of that, then I think idealism is a serious contender. And I don't, what I'm against is like the mocking of idealism. And, way back with the very first podcast that I ever did before I knew what podcast was me and Pete Mandic. And basically where I was like, do you think science has refuted idealism? Because I don't think so. And I just think it's an open possibility that science has. And he was like, oh, come on. But, he just said, no, I think it's refuted because it's silly. Basically, I think that's a quote from what he said, not because of empirical reasons. I don't think it's silly. I think it's a serious response to these issues if you're moved in a certain way by certain considerations, which I happen to not be.
I mean, my view on those things is I can kind of see both sides, right? So there's a whole discussion to be had there about maybe what I consider ridiculous kind of depends on the context, because I can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So it's like, maybe I forget, is it the bishop, whatever is it, the guy who when I refute it thus by kicking kicking the rock or whatever. I think for most people that's going to be the bounds of ridiculous, like maybe most ordinary people. I would think. I don't actually have any empirical evidence for that, I should caveat, but that's my
what's the bounds of ridiculous, that it's like kicking the rock is ridiculous.
No, like kicking the rock just demonstrates physical, that considering these idealistic
that's a silly idea.
Well, it is in the context of reflective equilibrium in the philosophy room, right? But I would think maybe for a lot of people, that's maybe what they mean by ridiculous. Like, what I'm saying is what ridiculous means is going to change in different contexts. And so I can see how for most things, most things people are trying to do, they're going to be like, yeah, like idealism, get out of here. But then when it comes to reflecting on our views and trying to build like consistent models of overall reality or something, it's like, well, actually this does work. You know, it all sits together, it's on the table still, that or maybe other considerations, like you said, like it sits in a respectable tradition, so those might justify it in that kind of context as not being ridiculous by those criteria. So I can kind of see both sides of
well, I think it's not ridiculous by the first criteria either. But I mean, so the kicking of the rock to like refute idealism is ridiculous. That's silly only because it doesn't take the argument seriously
on its own
and
terms.
It's a straw man. Like that is literally a meme before memes were meme. That is like a straw, like that is a, you know, a very poor representation of the argument that Berkeley was trying to make. And by the way, Berkeley and Bernardo are different because Berkeley is subjective idealism and objective idealism, analytic idealism, whatever.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so anyway,
well, it's obviously
I don't really see it as ridiculous.
Maybe I can make it. So it's obviously question begging construed in one sense, right? Which is to say, like on the idealist's own terms of you hit the appearance of the rock, right? So that it's just consistent with my idealism. I think that maybe there's a different way that you could interpret what's going on there, right? Which is maybe in terms of, well, in ordinary life and experiences, I'm trying to do things, and when I try and do things, I make appeal to certain types of things in order to do them, and so I just don't need your theory doesn't feature in my kind of like instrumentalist or pragmatic conception of reality or something like that, right? And kicking a rock is supposed to be maybe an example of a very ordinary like type of physical activity people engage in. Maybe something along those lines is but then again, that's probably not what most ordinary people would say, who would rule it as ridiculous. So maybe there's a few different ways of looking at it. I'm just to say, I can see where people are coming from when they say it's ridiculous, and I can see where people I don't know how you resolve all of these views together. I mean,
yeah, but I think most people, I think most ordinary people are almost idealists. They just don't know it. So like I teach this stuff all the time, and I know you can't just assume because your students over 20 years have said X and therefore X, which is a common professor fallacy. But still, my students over many years have whenever we're like
when you press
discussing these things. Well, I always give writing assignments where I have to talk about stuff and ask them to reflect on things. So I ask them like, what is physical? And they almost to a person say it's that which we can taste, touch, and smell. And therefore
it's because they're all pragmatists.
Yeah, because they're all like, it's this stuff right here. And that was Berkeley's argument.
Yeah.
So whenever I read that, I always say to them, oh, so there's tables and chairs in your dreams, right? Because you're tasting and touching them in your dreams. Like, oh no, there's no tables in my dreams. That's the whole point of their arguments. It's the same experience. Experientially, it's the same. So if that's what you mean by physical object, and that's what got us into this. We were talking about, what do you mean by physical? Remember way back when? And so if what you mean by physical is just that what you can bump into, and then you say, what is and you sort of start with this common sense notion. Look, I'm going to grab something physical, and it's this. And I want to know what the nature of this is. Yeah. And whatever this is, its nature, that's what I mean by physical. And if that turns out to be consciousness, then gee, I guess what I meant by physical was consciousness. So in this way, I do think that like, this is where the 2D semantics of people like Chalmers comes in. I think if you think of different possible worlds as being the actual world, like bracketing, like where we are in conceptual space and going, okay, if that was the way the world was, and I was in that world, what he calls a centered world or something, if you like these fancy terms, then you can reason about things from that point of view. It doesn't mean it's true here in our world, but it would be like, what would be true if that were the actual world? So I think that these kinds of questions, if this were an idealism world, like Bernardo thinks the world is, then what we mean by physical would be this stuff. That's what it would be. So if in a person like the ordinary person, when they go around saying what's physical, that's what they would end up meaning. They might not know it. Just like when they say we physicalists think that when they are talking about water, they're talking about H2O without knowing it. So I do think a lot depends on like what world you're starting at if you're going to define the terms in this way as like the stuff I can grab,
Mhm.
which is why part of me ultimately doesn't care about like how you define the term physical, because like that's what I was trying to say way back when, is like as long as it's not mental at the bottom, then I think you can rule
Okay.
out Bernardo's views as being ones I think of as physical.
Mhm.
But then also like on a more expansive notion of the word physical, I think it kind of almost doesn't matter. Like even in a simulation, it could still be the case that my identity theory was true, the mind brain,
Mhm.
that the brain being simulated was the thing that was
Right.
important. So I think a lot of these questions kind of depending on like how you start will come
Yes.
out very differently, which is why I spend this long-winded time trying to say where you start matters.
Yeah, sure. No, don't, it's. I think we covered important topics in that one question that we were trying to answer. But yeah, I did, to come on to your own views a little bit, just because of obviously finite time as well. So you mentioned as well the hard problem and your views you kind of briefly touched on. But do you want to give a bit more detail around how, like, firstly, what you consider the hard problem to be, on your own terms, and how you respond to or resolve that problem?
Okay, sure. Remember, I still have a question for you, so don't try to
Yes,
escape.
we'll get. No, I won't try and escape. Don't worry. I'm just conscious of there's no. I don't know. Do you have like time after 2 o'clock a little bit if we overrun, or do you have a pretty?
Yeah, I can basically be around till 3.
Okay, cool. And is that, sorry? That's when is that 3 for you? Is that like an hour and a half? Or
Like
something?
for an hour.
Okay, cool. Right.
Yeah, no, I forget. Where are you?
I'm in the UK, so yeah.
Cool. I am. I'm on the island of Long.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I've got all the time in the world, but so
Yeah, I don't
I won't
have
run
kids
away from
coming
it.
from home and a wife who's
Yeah.
like, don't spend all day on the internet with me down here with these kids. I'm like, yeah, okay. It is quite the contrast when you're like trying to have a rational discussion. You're like, A leads to B, and you go downstairs and like chaos. Not rational, but we're trying to download civilization into their little brains currently as we speak. Okay, it is quite hard, and they fight it very strongly. Anyway, so you're asking me about the hard problem and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
So partly in the way I asked the question as well was like I wanted to get how you think of the framing of the question, because I think obviously sometimes people will introduce people in a particular kind of way, but often when people have thought about it a lot, they might want to be sensitive to certain ways that the question is even posed, or highlight people's attention to
Yeah,
certain aspects of that.
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the kind of generic and standard way to say the hard problem is just it's the question of why the physical basis of an experience is the physical basis of that experience as opposed to a different one or none at all. So that the idea kind of starts with the correlations between physical states and conscious experience. Um, and science studies these, and I'm involved in some of these debates. Like, what part is this experience correlated with? Is it a higher order part, a lower order part? How in the brain does that map onto these things? So, we are still fighting about this stuff. It's not like this is resolved or anything, but we have noticed that there are these correlations between the activity in the brain and the experiences that people have. And we're starting to map out these correlations. And we have crude tools. fMRI is very crude, extremely crude, even though it's exciting and wonderful and new. From, I guess, if things from the 80s can still be wonderful and new, uh, it is a truly fantastic tool, but it's very crude.
And
It's,
it works on dead salmon.
yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say, and there's all sorts of methodological problems which haven't really been dealt with, I would say, by the field in a very serious way. And we've already seen the kind of replication crisis that happens in social psych, which I would probably expect is more widespread than that. So we have to always be aware of this. But we have other methods as well, by the way, more invasive methods. And I almost wanted to switch into neuroscience because the more invasive methods answer these questions more interestingly. But I personally can't do it. When I started working with rats, I was raised vegetarian. I'm a vegan. I love animals. I understand that experimenting on animals is necessary. I will defend it actually conceptually, but doing it is another thing. And I know that's a hypocritical attitude, and maybe, but I don't think so. So we could debate that. And people love to play gotcha games with the vegans, so I'm always there for those gotcha games. But anyway, so the hard problem starts from the recognition that there are these correlations. And then also that we can explain some things fairly well. Like we think how to explain what a memory is and what the retrieval of a memory looks like. And we have models of that. And people debate about whether it's long-term potentiation or some other, the Krebs molecule. Like, so we know a lot of things and people debate about what the mechanism is. And it's not solved science, but we sort of understand in a conceptual way what it would mean to have information represented in a format, have that format stored in a certain way, retrieve that thing, have systems set up to read it out, and then produce certain verbal behaviors like, oh yeah, my shoe is over there. And then even tell stories about how there are systems that control the physical mechanisms and walk you over there and blah, blah, blah. So we don't have a completed story about that, but we kind of see how you could. In the way that we were talking about earlier in terms of neurons connecting, and it's like there's this mechanism, and it's actually, once you start looking at it, it looks like just mechanisms inside mechanisms inside mechanisms inside mechanisms, and you're like, wow. Like there's this famous little robotics experiment where they build this robotic cricket, and it's only got like 2 sensors and 3 internal states, and it does pretty good at imitating the behavior of a cricket, as far as like if it hears a sound, it'll orient towards the sound and it'll move towards it only when the lights are off. And the idea is just that we're just really complicated crickets on some level like that. And that the surprising things we do is just like the trillions of parts that were made up. The mechanisms are just so fantastically complicated. Okay, great. And so you can just run through this whole story. But then you get to the question of, oh, so where does consciousness fit into this story? And the hard problem really is trying to start from this claim that there's a difference between those things that I was just mentioning, which look obviously associated with a function. And the job of science is to look for the mechanism that performs that function. Just seems obvious that's what memory is. And even in the history of science, it seemed obvious that's what life was. The functions included things like reproduction and homeostasis. The debate was over how could something physical do those functions? So there is a way of looking at the history, even in those areas where things were recognizably sort of functionally analyzable in terms of structure and function, like we talked about earlier. And then the question was like, how could something physical do that? So then later we sort of learned about DNA, and people said, okay, so there's reproduction. We learned about metabolism. They said, okay, so there's energy. And so we learned a bunch of stuff that filled in those pieces of how those functions could be done physically. But we always sort of knew that what we were looking for was how these functions are performed, like what's the mechanism. So the question was, could it be physical? But when it now the grand finale, when it comes to consciousness, there's at least, and I agree with this, there's at least the seeming of a separateness from function, in the sense that you can kind of not obviously encounter any contradiction with imagining things being otherwise. So, the way I like to contrast this is like using real neuroscience. So we know that when you see red, there's activity in the visual areas of the brain, culminating in what we think of as the V4, the fourth visual area. Ooh, fancy V4. So there's activity in V4. Okay, so but what is activity in V4? Well, that just means there are neurons that have ion channels, which are opening and closing, and there's potassium and sodium and chloride, and these things are going in and out of these neurons in such a way that they produce what we call an action potential, which is an electrical discharge, which itself is just ion channels opening and closing along the axon, ions going in, ions coming out. So actually, when you look in V4 and you say, what's so fascinatingly red about what's going on there? It's nothing. It's just action potentials, sodium ions. Okay, great. So wonderful. But then you think about hearing the sound of a bell or an oboe. not the same as seeing red phenomenologically at all. Very different experiences. And you look in the brain and you go, aha, well, did you know there's auditory cortex? And there's even, just like there's V1, there's A1, auditory cortex area 1. And you can, there's activity in those areas when you hear the sound. And you go, interesting, what's different? And you look at it and you go, oh, gee, it's ions and sodium and potassium and gates closing. And then also, by the way, there are other neurons in your brainstem controlling your heart rate and breathing, and you have no experience of those, it would seem. What are they doing? Oh, it's ions and sodium channels. And you just look at these and you go, what about this activity here would ever suggest that one of these is seeing red and the other is hearing a sound and the other is a non-conscious control of breathing? So how could you look, what in that description implies any of that? And the answer is, it doesn't seem like anything, actually. It sort of seems like it could have been the other way before knowing any of this stuff. I might have looked in the brain and found out it was that activity in the brainstem that was there when I see red, as opposed to not having any experience at all associated with that activity. Or it might have been the activity here where my auditory cortex is that was associated with vision. So why is it these neurons acting in that way when really they're acting in the same way? And that's the surprising thing about neuroscience, actually, is that the more you study it, the more you sort of see is that there's not a lot that distinguishes these things. It's the timing, the firing of these patterns, at least as far as our neuroscience that we, people will say maybe we have to change. But anyway, what we know now is that it's these patterns of activity, and we understand in an abstract way from computer science how you could encode information in patterns of activity like that. So we, in an abstract way, understand how the brain could kind of be a computer and compute various things and implement various functions, so forth and so on. But it's not clear how any of that would be, why you would ever be led from any of that, if you just studied that, to realizing that what it's like to see red is like having that quality present, and what it's like to hear an oboe is like hearing a different quality present. So in other words, it just doesn't seem to be the sort of thing which structure and function tell you about, which is why the master argument against physicalism from the Chalmers camp really is as follows: that physical science explains structure and function. Consciousness can't be explained by that, so it can't be explained by physical science. Now, where I would quibble is I would add seemingly. Consciousness doesn't seem to be associated with any function, and therefore it doesn't seem like it can be explained by science. So I would want to claim those, qualify those as epistemic, as opposed to like getting. And I think Chalmers knows, but I think it's real easy for people to slide over that. Anyway, so I do think that the more you study the brain, the more you are struck by how it's like all the same in a way. And actually, if you had this certain kind of brain damage, the part that processed sound would suddenly start doing color, and then now those neurons firing would be like seeing red as opposed to hearing the oboe. So it's not like they're magic in that area. They've got to be doing something, but what they're doing looks like what everything else is doing. So then the puzzle is to explain why the experience of red is associated with that as opposed to something else. Or, it's like, so that seems to me like a legitimate challenge, and what a theory of consciousness in the fullness of time should be able to say something about. So I don't know. So that's what I think of as the hard problem, is trying to answer that question. Notice how even there, I think that the idealists like Bernardo have the hard problem. So they can't answer that question. They can't answer the question, why is it that this brain state is associated with red as opposed to blue? Or they can only say what the neuroscientists say, which is, we don't fucking know, dude. Because that's the visual area, bro. Like, that's why. The best answer the neuroscientists have is this line label stuff. Well, it comes from the eyes, so duh. But no, by the time you get to color vision itself, you're way past the eyes, man. V4 is way past anything we would recognize as directly coming from the eye. It's been through several stages of processing, back and forth. Anyway, I think that the idealists have this exact same problem. They can't answer this question, and saying everything is consciousness, or even saying consciousness at the fundamental level, like panpsychists do, you still get this question, but why this brain state? Why this pattern of activity? Why any of that stuff? And I was just watching this earlier for my YouTube channel for this Kevin O'Regan sensory motor and activism stuff. And he was like, this dissolves the hard problem. Things are squishy because when you press on them, they give, don't you know? It's like, but that's not solving the hard problem. That explains a bunch of other stuff. But the hard problem is like, why does it feel the way it does, as opposed to no way at all?
Yeah, because you can frame that in terms of mechanistic feedback, but you still can't frame that in terms of an explanation of why it feels that way rather than any other way to experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this gets us to all the Mary's Rooms argument stuff, which is, I watched your video on this before you invited me on, by the way, just because you said simple and convincing answer to Mary's.
Well, I'm gaming the system. Like, I'm gaming the system as well. I'm trying to boost engagement. That's what that is. But we can talk about that in a second.
Yeah, no, okay. But so it boosted because I came in. I mean, sometimes, to be honest, I tune in and you're like pounding on the table and singing off key, and I'm like, later. But some people like that stuff, so I'm not hating on it. I'm just saying, sometimes it's not for me. But I love that you feel comfortable enough to be able to do that. And I know you got to kill time before people show up some way, so why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But anyway, so what was I forget how I even got on all this stuff, but
sorry. Hard problem. And so you framed the hard problem as you see it, and I think you've done a good job at not strawmanning it, though I would say in a way you've strawmanned it, because when you not in a terrible way, but in a way that will make people more sympathetic to physicalism, because when you describe
I mentioned brains.
The physical. Well, not just that. You said, when you study this stuff, you find out that there's a lot of complexity at this level, and then there's a lot of complexity at this level, and you gave too much detail. You've got to leave as much detail out as possible. Yeah, so
I think the detail matters. Actually, I see. I don't think that's straw manning.
Yeah, I meant that tongue in cheek. I'm being tongue in cheek. Yeah. So,
I see.
So what is your?
But then to sum all this up, then I think that it is kind of you can frame this as saying that one way to put this is by noting that there's no a priori entailment between knowing about the physical facts and knowing about consciousness. Although parts of me on some days, I really start to worry about that and question it. And, so I'm not fully, like I said, when I defend things, I'm usually trying to work them out. And that's why I like the way you started this conversation, because the more I dig in on something and push back on you, I'm really trying to figure out what I think about it, and hearing what you say back and the comments that I'll read later and all that stuff helps me think through these issues. So it's not like I'm super committed to these things. I have things that I think I am committed to, but my mind could be changed.
Yeah.
But so I do think this a priori entailment stuff is important, and that the hard problem is kind of wrapped up in issues related to the principle of sufficient reason and rationalism, more generally speaking, and this idea that what we need is an intelligible explanation, one that gives us a aha, a yes, a yeah, man, kind of feeling that we go, I get it. And that a lot of times what I encounter is that people say, I can't understand how it could be, so it's not. And that's the thing that I don't like the most. There's one thing that I don't like in these debates the most, it's that kind of attitude. And it's everywhere. It's from on every side. It's like, I don't understand how that could be the case, so you're stupid, duh. And I get that because I defend the identity theory, and people say, well, how could it be physical? And then they look at you, give you the incredulous stare. So I don't really think that's useful. It's like, I don't give them the incredulous stare. I try to think from their position. So it's like, yeah, anyway, the hard problem, I think, is involved in this a priori entailment kind of idea. And even those who deny, like Ned Block, who I'm very influenced by, even those who deny that there is this kind of a priori link between consciousness and the physical facts, they kind of start with the granting of the intuition that at least as what we know now, and maybe you're right, that if we really knew all the physical facts, it'd be case closed. And we would see how there's no room for this stuff, or we'd change our minds, or our concepts would be different by then, or I think there's lots of ways it could go. But anyway, given where we are now, I think that it's a bit tiresome to deny the existence of consciousness, or that this is sort of seems like it's different from a lot of other stuff, because it does. And anytime I find people saying it doesn't, it's like they sort of do admit at the end that it does, but then we're just like, we're wrong about it. But they sort of do admit at the end it does seem like that way. But anyway, so that's how I think about the hard problem. And whether it's going to be solved or dissolved, I don't know. So this is why when I wrote, I never expected to write a paper on zombies and a priori arguments. But when I got out of grad school, someone came at me very strongly on my blog, and they were like, "Hey, dumb shit, don't you know that physicalism is false?" And I had never really encountered that attitude before. I was like, "Whoa, I'm a dumb shit, and physicalism is false." I did not know that. And they were like, "It's false because of zombies, dude. Like, what the fuck?" And I was like, "Whoa, I just never, I was like, isn't this like something like from history that we don't really take serious anymore?" Turns out no. So I had to learn about all of this stuff from there. And I came to see that it's not just name calling. There's something really, I think, serious about this. But I forgot why I brought that up. I was distracted by thinking about this debate. But anyway.
So we're talking about that. So just your like solution to the hard problem.
Oh yeah, when it's going to be solved or dissolved. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So when I wrote on this, which I didn't expect to do, which is how I got distracted, my approach was to do what I call deprioritize it. So I was inspired by the discussion about marijuana and the police literature. So they were like, should we decriminalize it or deprioritize it? So deprioritizing is where you still say it's illegal, but you just say we're not going to enforce the law. So my idea was that something like that we should do with these a priori arguments. That we want to deprioritize them in the sense that we don't want to really trash on rationalism. I don't want to fight them. I want to grant them that. And I want to say, even if you grant them that, you don't get the conclusion you want. And then I think there are reasons for that. But so what I was trying to argue for was that we should deprioritize these arguments until we have more empirical data. Because the analogy I was trying to draw was with like Aristotle thinking about water and thinking of it as a simple substance with no parts, and how he just thought it was inconceivable that water had parts. He kind of says this when he's trashing on Democritus, when Democritus claims that water is composed of atoms, and Aristotle's just like, what are you talking about? Like, it doesn't, it's clearly a simple substance. But of course, now we know how to conceive of that. So in the fullness of time, I think that we will be able to a priori know, because I think we can a priori know that water is H2O.
I was going to make a similar comment, I think, as the one you're making, which is that I think maybe it's that the a priori here, there's like a kind of myth around it, as if it's this space of pure reason with these given concepts that exist and don't come from anywhere or anything. Whereas I think the reality is quite different. Our concepts of things are really informed by the way that we're taught the concepts, right? I don't just have like a pure essence of water. So for someone who's not studied computer science or something, you could tell them a bunch of facts about the way that logic gates or something work, and you don't have to make it you can make it analogous, because I know the accusation will come, well, you're talking about the qualitative experience of seeing the computer screen or something, but I mean, you can talk about some function that a computer performs in terms of memory operations or processing lots of data or something. It's like, well, how the hell do you get that from like just combining these things together? Like that, people are not going to have the intuitions in the a priori about that and that, because you need to just learn a lot of stuff to have those intuitions. Is that similarly where you're coming from on that?
In a way, yeah. So what I would say is that if you want to know something a priori, then it's got to be independent of experience. So what does that mean? Well, I don't know, but let's just say that vision and introspection and things like that count as experience. So do we ever learn anything in a purely a priori way? No, all of our concepts are come in through experience and introspection, you might think. Maybe there's some we could abstract out of there that you could see how are independent of that or go beyond it or whatever, but they all start from there. And the idea that, so I would say that we know that water is H2O a priori because, and I'm very much influenced by the work of David Chalmers on this, because there's a priori conditional statement of the form if P then Q, which you could say, if the world is thus and such, where thus and such is filled in with the physics that we think is true, if the world is this way, and then you insert quantum mechanics, relativity theory, chemistry, all the, I mean, and a completeness of all that, then water is H2O. And I think even if you didn't know whether the antecedent of that conditional were true, you still could. So you didn't have the experience and know if the world was that way at all. You could still see that if the world were that way, then water would be H2O. And you could know that a priori, so that an ideal agent who had no experience of our world or the way that it was could come to that conclusion in an a priori sense. Well, maybe they'd have to have experience to get the concepts. Who knows? But
I think, I think that's
they'd be able to reason their way without relying on that.
Yeah, I get where you're. I do struggle with that just because I think of concepts and like basically linguistic thought as having to be trained. So I struggle with the idea that so I can kind of understand what I'm imagining there, but I struggle to understand it in the sense of like, you know, I'm getting at almost like some pure propositional knowledge or something, because I guess I just don't think of like a realm of pure propositional knowledge. I kind of think more of just contingent languages that people can think in when they're trained into them. So maybe I'd have a harder time with that on my view. But I get what you're saying in terms of if you accept this competing view, then yeah, that's the way you think about the a priori, right? Is
exactly. Well, this is what I'm saying is that I'd rather like grant this to the opponent rather than argue with them about it and show them that they still can't have the conclusion that they want, which is that physicalism is false. So that's my strategy, is to say, look, I don't want to argue with you about all that stuff, because on certain days of the week I'm kind of sympathetic to it. But even if you have all that stuff, you haven't shown physicalism is false. That's my view. So that's what I think I'm trying to show here, is that so the way that we know that water is H2O a priori in a sense is, well, first of all, empirically, we learned that water is H2O. We didn't know it a priori. We, like us, humans here. So an ideal reasoner might be able to know that a priori if you buy the line that they have. So an ideal agent who knew all the physical facts could reason from those to know that water is H2O. But we, us muddle-headed, non-ideal reasoners, didn't learn it that way. But even so, once we empirically figured out that water was H2O, now we can look back on that a priori conditional and go, oh yeah, and if the world is this way, then water is H2O. So even we can know it now, like you and I think, know it a priori in a way that, you know, Aristotle couldn't, or even the people who discovered that water is H2O. If you want to put it that way. And by the way, I saw someone in your comments on this video mentioning the Chang's book. Yeah, I love that book. I think everyone should read it. I didn't know there were lectures on it, so I'm going to go and watch those. I thought I was very excited to find that out. So anyway, I think that you could tell the same story about like the knowledge that Mary gets, so that while she can't a priori know it in her room, she might come out and look at red, acquire the concept, and then be able to a priori know it in the way that she would know this a priori conditional statement. So I think that, yeah, even if you grant them they're all the premise, everything, you still don't get that physicalism is false. And that's what all my business about zombies and all that stuff is. It's like, if you want to say that physicalism is false because you can conceive of zombies, then I think I can conceive of what, you know, I call zombies, physical creatures with consciousness and nothing else. And then it's like, well, if we're playing this game, they both can't really be conceivable.
Yeah.
So you have to give something up here, wrong. Like something's wrong. And then it really, the only difference between pounding of tables is like where you started from. So Chalmers kind of starts from dualism and ends up on the zombie side. And I kind of start from physicalism, end up on the physical side. So given that people actually, in fact, disagree about whether these things are conceivable, and they both can't be, then isn't that evidence that something we should be a little more humble and recognize that maybe we're not sure which one of these really is the ideally conceivable one? And that's my de-prioritizing strategy. It's like, we don't know which one. Zombies could be the ideally conceivable one. We might learn a bunch of science and then go, oh yeah. Or we might learn a bunch of science and go, yeah, see, they're not ideally conceivable. Here's how you a priori do it. But it requires a lot of empirical work in the way that we learned about water and H2O. And so being Aristotle and sitting around going, it's just not going to cut it, because we need a load more of science and phenomenology. I would say we need to actually know some stuff about experience. So I just think it's premature to be going around trumpeting what reason does or doesn't show about this, because reason might show that physicalism is the one that comes out. It's not clear. It depends a lot on how science goes. So that's my official view. That's why I say deprioritize. Like, stop arguing about what's ideally conceivable. We can't tell. And when you put that objection to the Chalmers types, he kind of goes, look, I know I'm not an ideal reasoner, but I sort of know a few things about what an ideal reasoner would say. And I go, really? Okay. Must be nice to go to Oxford and know about ideal reasoners. But, some of us go to community colleges and are unsure of ourselves. And there is a part of me that thinks that there is this difference between Chalmers and I, and in the sense that Chalmers was a mathematically inclined person who, he really did get a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford to study mathematics. And I'm also, I would say, a mathematically inclined person and not getting Rhodes Scholarships. And what's the difference? The difference is I'm not very good at math. I'm better than most people, but I'm not like as good as the good ones are. Where Chalmers is like on that level, I would say he's on a higher plane as far as that reasoning is concerned, and the clearness about how these connections are made. Whereas I only see them dimly through a foggy shroud that I sort of can fumble around on, but I don't have this clear sense of the mathematical structure, whereas I think he does. So when I have this, so one time I was arguing with someone and they were like, you don't know what, like, this is about God now. They were like, you don't know what it was like to know everything. You can't talk about being omniscient. And I was like, yeah, I know exactly what it would be like to know everything. It would be like me already, but just being right. Because when people ask me a question, I spontaneously come up with an answer. And to be omniscient is just to always do that right. You just always get the spontaneous right answer. But me, I spontaneously come up with answers that I work through later, then find out they're the wrong answers. I'm talking about math, not just about philosophy or science or anything. Just like, people ask mathematical questions and I'll come up with an answer and then work through the details. I'll be, dang, I left out this. I forgot a parentheses. In my head, I wasn't doing it right. So I've had the experience many times of feeling confident about some computation and having the experience of being wrong and then working back through it and being like, okay, now I really get it. Whereas I don't think Chalmers has ever had that experience, honestly. I feel like he has more had the experience of always leaping to the intuitively correct answer in mathematics. And then one comes to have this trust.
Yeah.
Yes, this trust of their intuitive sureness that it just like, bam, that's got to be right. Because, and Kripke said this one time, I remember, because I had some classes with Saul Kripke. I was lucky enough to sit around and listen to him ramble. But he said one time he was like, someone was asking him, he was like, what better evidence could there ever be than an intuition? I was like, holy shit.
I think I've read something about Descartes' influences and clear and distinct ideas as well that says something similar about his teacher Clavius or something, who was like a really good mathematician and taught in terms of, like you get a clear and distinct intuition of some mathematical concept. And this was like a Thomist guy I was reading who was trying to draw this connection between how that affected then Descartes' kind of quest for certainty and role of intuition and stuff. So maybe something similar going on there as well. Yeah,
exactly. So just to finish my thought, I was just saying that whereas I have the experience of intuitively thinking X and finding out X is wrong in a domain where there's absolute proof, like mathematics, whereas Chalmers has the intuitive experience of thinking X and finding out, yeah, right, it is X. I think that transfers over to this other area where we're thinking about things, and he feels a more on a sure ground than I do, because I'm constantly second guessing my intuitive judgments. But that's why I try to challenge their intuitive judgments by saying, look, here's another one, like that these things are physical. And sometimes when you say this to Chalmers, he says, look, most people like, how do you prove that zombies are conceivable? I don't know. Like, most history is about how hard consciousness is to understand. I'm like, yeah, except for the other half of history where everyone's like, it's easy to understand. Like the Hobbeses of the world, the Democrituses of the world, like they were out there as well. I mean, they were calling Hobbes the great Satan and everything like that because he was a physicalist who thought it was just like, motions in the brain. That's physical shit. So these ideas have been out there, and I don't think it's fair to say that one side has an intuitive, claim on it. So anyway, and I'm not trying to trash Chalmers or anything. I respect his mind and the way he does philosophy, and tremendously. But I do think that he tends to overestimate, like, how humble he should be. And when I've challenged him on, I shouldn't tell the story, but one time when I first met Chalmers, and I was kind of really drunk actually, but it's hard being a vegan at philosophy events when all there is wine and no vegan food at the dinner. So then you're just drinking all night and there's no food, and it's lead to a lot of bad Richard Brown experiences. This actual real stuff. But anyway, so we were out one night and Chalmers was just like, I guess he was coming to New York to like for his job talk, basically to end up at NYU. He was just flirting with the idea. They were trying to get him to come, you know, and as we know, he's been here for a long time. But anyway, so he was just coming, he was giving a talk at the grad center and we went out afterwards. Like I said, I was pretty liquored up. So I wasn't, you know, being as responsible as I should have been. But I remember like I made a bet with him that night about, and I lost that bet down. But anyway, so I asked him, I was like, look, dude, are you just someone who's really smart and came up with this wackadoo idea? And like, you're like, here's an argument that I can make. And that is, you know, airtight argument, but like, do you really believe this shit? Like, do you honestly believe that consciousness is like fundamental and not like, I was like, dude, like just straight up, dude, like for real, bro, like seriously. And first of all, he was like, that's insulting. And I was like, okay, you know, so I'm drunk, but like honestly, like do you, and I kind of have become convinced that, yeah, no, it's because I was so convinced, like I was like, how could you like be so convinced by your own I don't get it that you are like
maybe you were the inspiration for the incredulous stare. Maybe that's what he was.
Yeah, right, exactly. Maybe, I don't know. But I don't think it's disingenuousness or cleverness or, you know, because then it makes some of these accusations sometimes too. It's like it's just word games, it's just schmess instead of chess. And I don't really I think that maybe it could be that in some cases, but I don't think it's that in a lot of cases, not for Bernardo, not for Chalmers, and not for a lot of people. I think that there's a deep interest and curiosity about consciousness. Yeah, exactly. That there's a, you know, and the story about Chalmers is that he was a dedicated physicalist until he had some weird experience where he realized that he didn't see in 3D or something like that, that he was having 2D vision or something. And then he got it corrected and the world changed and he was like, holy shit, consciousness. So, I mean, maybe that's a caricature, but I do think that he is really puzzled by these things. And that honest intellectual persons are puzzled by these things, even if I think that we could explain some of this stuff by their, you know, background biases or stuff. I don't think that really undermines the argument. I think it kind of undermines the force that a lot of people take the argument to have, which is why my deprioritizing strategy. But anyway, so I don't think that's, so part of me thinks that a way that could go is that in the fullness of time, our concept of consciousness will have changed.
Yes.
So that the hard problem will be,
it's just not
sort of have a functional.
Yeah.
But to do that, you would have to have a functional, or, I mean, I don't even see how you could do it, because you'd have to somehow, in the concept of consciousness, have a hook, a connection to all of this stuff in the brain that we can't see how it would.
Well, I think
or it could go as follows, or it could go, it just is. And I think my considered view is the brute identity view, the one that I think just the most like umph to it is just like some things just are, and it might just be a brain state. And I don't think that anyone's bafflement about how it could be counts against it.
I think that there's almost a whiff of the like epistemic Meno's paradox thing going on here. You know, it's something like, you know, if you already know it, then you know what the thing is. But how could you know what you don't know if you don't know what it is, because you don't know what it is, like kind of thing. It's like, and I think that is it's there's like a false dichotomy there, because you're kind of you get some grasp of a thing, but maybe not the full thing, or you know there's a gap in you. And I think that it's more like that. But I think that you reflect on it and you think, well, yeah, really, what would the right sort of explanation look like? You know, you identified there's this epistemic gap in your explanation. You're like, yeah, what would but if you knew what the right sort of explanation was, well, then the problem would be solved. So it's kind of almost a trust that you'd get to that point. Is there anything else on the whole problem point? Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, I was just saying, it's kind of related to the Kripkean paradox of dogmatism, where it's like, if you know something, then you shouldn't be looking for evidence against it. But of course, being shut off to evidence is a weird thing. So like, there is a weird, there's a weird paradox there. I think it's connected to that. But anyway, so I don't mean to cut you off.
So, do you want, just because of time, to move on to then like the video I made about the knowledge argument? I will caveat up front that that's not my entire view on the knowledge argument, right? But I think that is at least one tool for people to think about it, where I think they can see one of the funky things. I think there's a number of funky things going on in the knowledge argument, right? Some of them to do with people's understanding of, you know, what words like possibility mean and different ways of interpreting those and things like that as well. And also the role that intuitions play in kind of like conceiving the case as well. And that I think that when people reflect on things, they might be driven to an overall consistent view where their intuitions are actually slightly different, right? But one of the responses that I was making, and this is something I often do, is I'm kind of sympathetic to a type of identity theory, not a type identity theory, but a type of identity theory, right? Where I think what I often do is just accept the term. I think there's probably something wrong with the terms that the debate's framed in, right, in the first place. But in order to highlight this to people, I'll often kind of just accept what a lot of people consider to be almost the worst physicalist theory or model, which is going to be some kind of identity theory, right? I know you can still hear me, by the way, so I'll keep talking.
Yes, you keep going. I'm just opening a window because it got a little.
No worries. And so what I often do there is I'll just basically go about showing how someone who adheres to this type of model would handle all of these cases, like different intuition pumps or different things that it's alleged a theory needs to explain, right? And I'll show how it explains them all. But I'll also be super honest about the gaps and problems. So, you know, like the amount of bruteness or maybe the amount of kind of mystery that remains in the explanation. And then I'll just say, but then I compare that, right, to these rival theories. And it's, you know, it's kind of like the Churchill democracy argument. It's like, yeah, this is a really bad theory right now, but it's actually kind of better than a lot of these others. and so I agree, like I would much rather have a better, more fleshed out theory, or I'll try and interrogate the terms the debate's framed in to figure out, have we made some wrong step that's leading us to have weird, you know, just consider like a weird problem that's not a real problem or something. But if we do get to that stage, I'm like, I still think you actually solve it in this direction. And then that's where on the knowledge argument, one of the things I was saying, and you can, you know, pick up if you think there's a problem in this response, is that I think something that you can reflect on if you're going to accept some kind of identity theory is that basically having propositional knowledge, or, you know, having belief states is a particular type of state to be in. You know, when I consider the cat is on the mat, then I'm in a particular type of state. But my experience of the cat being on the mat is you know, another state. Maybe you want to call that an E state or something, if you want to predicate the two to make it clearer. So you can say there's like a K state, which is a knowledge state, an E state, which is an experiential state. And maybe what's going on in that case of Mary is that you consider her in all the K states, but then that obviously doesn't entail that she has all the E states, because she'll only have the E states that she was stimulated to be in. And then someone might respond to that in a certain way. And I think that all the options for how they would respond to that, to say there's a problem in the way you're conceptualizing it, lead to an overall, you know, you either end up basically saying, well, then she is in all the states, right, as well. And actually, then of course she has the experience. She's already had the experience when she steps out of the room. And so whichever way you go, there's not a problem. So that's to clarify what I said about that and my kind of views. Cool.
So first of all, type identity theory is not the worst kind of physicalism. It's the best. I think there's any reason to, very little reason to think the type identity theory is wrong. And most of the reason for thinking that comes from thought experiments. This is something I was just arguing with Eric Switchkabel about on my channel recently when he came over. But I really take that seriously, that that the only counterexamples to the type identity theory come from fanciful thought experiments. And that, in fact, surprisingly, the more we know about stuff, the more we're finding that there's the same kind of states, it's the same kind of physical hardware doing the same kind of job. So I do think that this multiple realizability and stuff doesn't really hold much water, at least until we have some plausible examples on the table. Okay, so, you know, I'm still for type identity theory. I think type identity theory is a serious view, and that people have dismissed it too quickly. So
I didn't mean to dismiss it. I'll highlight by saying I didn't mean to dismiss it as well, but I just think there's so much baggage that comes along with it, though, because I think there's basically going to have to be some, even with a type identity theory, there's some sense in which you're not saying the exact same physical state, right? So that's going to have to be clarified, because there's going to be, you know, maybe maybe the physical state is a particular kind of thing, but maybe there's a different number of, you know, potassium protons on one side of a neuron in your brain to mine, and we still say, you know, so you're going to have to account for that. And maybe there's some degree of private, oh, not private, but some experiential difference as well, and you're going to have to account for that. And we still call them both, you know.
Yeah, I think you can do all that, you know.
Yeah.
I think science already done that. So, you know, we have subtypes already in science, and there are subtypes of water. No one goes around saying water isn't, well, some people do, but the water is H2O, but what about deuterium? H3O, homie. So it's water, but it's a subtype of water, and it's, you can see that it's a subtype because it's recognizably related to the overarching type. But anyway, so I don't want to get distracted about the identity theory, but I'll go all about this all day, because I really think that the identity theory has been wrongly maligned. Anyway, so, but I, you know, token identity, I think that's really functionalism, actually. And I think you might have questions about causal powers and which level is doing it. So I really think the simplest view is type identity. But that's, you know, people can debate about that. No one cares. Or maybe someone cares, but we don't care that they care. So the point, though, is the knowledge argument. I don't really think that you did justice to it. And
okay, sure.
I don't really think that this response, as much as I love the identity theory, I don't think that it is even addressing the issue. So the issue is about whether Mary has due knowledge. So do you think she does? You're just gonna say it's e-knowledge, right?
Well, it depends, because I can think about it in different kinds of ways, right? So it depends on what I'm conceiving of when I conceive her learning all the facts in the room. So I'm either going to conceive of
suppose that we confine it to microphysical facts.
To microphysical facts, yeah, I think that she will gain new knowledge, I think, when she goes outside the room. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Okay, so I didn't get that from your response just a second ago. But so then you have to say what kind of knowledge. So then there's the two kinds: knowledge how, knowledge that. So I think that's kind of where your response is going, is that she learns maybe something that's not a knowledge that, but is more like,
like, or maybe I'd even create a new type or something. I'd say like a know what it's like or something. If you know.
Okay. So what I think that you're not doing justice to in this characterization, which may be because you don't think it needs to be justice to. So I'm not saying you're wrong or this is bad, but I'm just saying I think that this is like where the other side's going to respond, is the idea that there is a kind of fact that she comes to know, whereby you can say that she learns her experiences like thus and such. She comes to be and that's a claim that she can make about her experience. Seeing red is like thus and such. Where she invokes the mental quality that she's now had contact with. And she can form a concept of that mental quality called phenomenal redness. And she can say, oh, seeing red is like phenomenal redness. And that's a truth claim. That it's something that could be true or false. Because, for example, you could think about invert Mary. A little twist on the subject here. Invert Mary is just like Mary, but has inverted red and green experiences. So when Mary comes, inverted Mary, so when Mary comes out, she sees the tomato and has a phenomenal red experience and forms the thought, seeing red is like phenomenal red. Whereas inverted Mary, whose color experiences are inverted with respect to regular Mary, comes out, looks at the tomato, has a green, what we would call a green experience, but then thinks the thought, seeing red is like phenomenal green. She doesn't say those words, but this quality is the one that's there, that's in this thought. So their two thoughts are different. They have different truth values. They're not the same. And so when Mary learns that seeing red is like this phenomenal quality, and you employing the concept, you know, phenomenal red to have the thought, seeing red is like this phenomenal quality. She learns something new that she didn't know in her room, and she learns it on the basis of the experiential state. But the thing that comes away from it is a fact, something that has a truth value, something that can be right or wrong. And that's what she didn't know in her room.
So,
So how does your
and-
response
yeah,
address
yeah.
this kind of primary thing?
So I think I kind of understand the objection, but I'm not sure exactly how it fits in maybe with how I'm conceiving of the argument, right? So maybe so if I step through things and just try and like kind of help me out here, right? So I'm thinking that one of the premises one of the premises of the argument is going to be that you know, something like physicalism is true, so necessarily all of the mental facts that there are determined by you know, physical facts in some sense. It doesn't, you know, it's going to be in the loosest sense possible, because you want to kind of encompass all physicalist views here, so supervenience, whatever, something like
Wait,
that.
this is going to be a premise in the Mary argument?
I think so. Yeah, I think so, right? Because you're trying to construct this case where then basically a way of translating that is going to make make this claim about possibility, where it's impossible to know all of the physical facts, the microphysical facts, and not know some fact about mental states, because there are, you know, so it's basically going to be a translation from like physicalism or whatever is this metaphysical claim about the necessity being understood in this way, and it follows from that then you've got this claim about the possibility of knowledge, you know, of knowing all facts, and it's impossible for there to be some mental fact that isn't kind of an entailment of that body of knowledge or something, right? Is that so? That's all right so far. So then the idea was,
wait, hold on. I think I may be misunderstanding something you're saying, Nathan. Because I think an assumption of the argument is that the physicalist is committed to that.
Yes,
therefore,
yeah, that's what I'm
you
saying.
give the
yeah,
but physicalism itself is not a premise of the argument. It's just that the physicalist thinks this is all there is.
Hypothetically, sorry, yeah. If physicalism is this, if that's true, then it's that's I didn't mean like a premise is like physicalism's true. I'm just saying like
I see. I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so then the idea is she steps out of the room, and I'm saying, I guess, that claim about physicalism is all of this about knowledge or propositional knowledge or whatever, right? And so the idea is, because she learns a new so you have the intuition, she learns a new fact, and that's a particular kind of phenomenal state. So now there's a new proposition, this is what redness is like. And that,
or there's a bunch of propositions. That's just one of them.
Sure,
so one of
but just for my cognitive abilities, though, I can't think of them all at once. just to get one of them, we go.
Seeing red is like this, or seeing red is like phenomenal red.
Okay,
like that.
The idea is, and the idea is that's a truth apt proposition, and it wasn't covered by all of these other cases or something like.
Well, she couldn't know it. If you buy that.
Yeah. No, I get that actually. I think that makes the
argument. So the mistake is not. So this is something, because I know you were like you didn't say this just now, but in the video you mentioned Churchland and stuff, and I think that the pregnant, you got like the getting pregnant versus the theory of pregnancy, that's an irrelevant issue in a sense. So the claim of the non-physicalist is not that studying this would put you in that experiential state.
Sure.
But rather it would allow you to see the truth of this propositional claim. Seeing red is like phenomenal red. And she can't. She just has no idea what seeing red is like.
Well, it's like, just as long as this is what red is like is a truth apt proposition, right? And you sign up to this other premise that it's impossible for there to be a truth apt proposition that isn't an entailment of microphysical facts. You've now got inconsistent, but I get that.
Exactly.
I have to,
so
I will.
So there's ways out. I'm not saying you should be convinced by this. I'm just saying I don't think that the response. Oh, but the experience is different than than propositional knowledge because of different states. Really gets at the heart of the matter, because the question is like, what does she learn?
No, I agree with that.
But if you say she learns an ability or something, then you're kind of denying that she like learns this thing that she can think this thought, that seeing red is like this, or like this. This is what it's like to see red, or whatever the case may be. And I just get the intuition very strongly that she could think those thoughts. And you could even do versions of this where she doesn't even have to come out of her room. So, you know, Mary in her room she's not a zombie. She has conscious experience. She sees black and white. So she has the phenomenology of black and white. She hears sounds. So she has the phenomenology of sound. It's not built into the experiment that she's like an experienceless robot. She's like a weird human. So she has human experiences, but just no color experiences. So she'll know, like, for example, that middle C in a certain pitch, she could sing that in her room. Oh, I can't do it, but you know, she could sound the note. And then 2 minutes later, sound the note again, and then recognize that they're like the same phenomenologically. So she could have this concept of being the same phenomenologically indistinguishable. She could know that that shade of black was phenomenologically indistinguishable from that shade of gray under a certain light. So there's a lot she could know in her room. And from the science that she's allegedly allowed to know, she would be able to know because she's, you know, super scientist. So given that, she wouldn't even have to leave her room because she could be thinking about two individuals outside the room and not know. So she could know that subject A is in brain state, you know, BN 4241, and subject B is in that same brain state and not know whether they have phenomenologically indistinguishable experiences. So she doesn't even have to see red. All that stuff is kind of like a red herring. She doesn't have to have the experience. Sure. The question is about whether knowing all that stuff is enough for you to be able to know the truth of the statement. Seeing red is like this quality. And it just sort of seems obvious once you put it that way. The answer is no, which is why a lot of people want to deny that you get that kind of knowledge. And that's why one major response, you either go, well, she gets that knowledge and it's like phenomenal concepts are weird, dude. Or you say she gets that knowledge, but it's know how, not know that. Or she gets that knowledge, but it's knowing an old fact in a new way. So there's lots of ways you can still try to weasel out of this, but I still think that you have to say, no, it's different than just like learning the equations should make you go into the brain state. That's not the argument. And I'm not seeing anyway, so you know.
No. I think that was actually that's helped me to clearly understand the argument in I think a stronger way. I definitely want to articulate in that stronger way and think about how not how I handle that in terms of just preserving like the conclusion, right? But I want to reflect on that because I think there's something fishy about this and the role that that's playing, and how that fits in with my view of propositions and so forth, and what I think.
And I just say that the use of the word "this" is not supposed to. So I don't think that this is an indexical term in a fancy philosophical language. I don't think that you can really that's what's doing the work here. Because remember, the invert Mary and the Mary, they are going to use the word "this." They're going to say, "This is what it's like to see red," and they're both going to do that. But they're going to be pointing thising, they're pointing. Yeah, so one's one's.
Well, I'll think about what.
So it's not that. It's what Chalmers calls a pure phenomenal concept, where you pick out the conscious experience by its conscious nature, by what it's like, not by this, but by it being phenomenally red. So that's what you pick it out by. That's why, you know, people like Goff talk about transparency and all that stuff. And I don't agree with them necessarily, but I do think that this is how they pick it out.
I do need to think about that a bit more though, because I think, you know, that the idea of this referring to the phenomenal state and saying like this is what's red's like, I'm not sure if that would shift me towards like, well, she obviously already had a kind of knowledge of like the phenomenal state of red, but it's presented to her in a new. I need to think about what I think about that.
Yeah, that's the new fact, new way of knowing an old fact.
But also with the additional case that you raised of inversion as well, I need to think about, well, what are my intuitions about that case as well, in terms of even whether I'm going to think it's possible given my construal of physicalism or not. I'd need to just reflect on that a bit and think, you know, what do I need to do with that information and what are my intuitions in that case? Because I'm not 100%.
That's why I think the best answer is that she comes out, acquires a concept that she didn't have before, and then would be able to do the a priori deductions. Because that's what you can't like do the water H2O stuff without knowing the concept of water. It just so happens that, you know, consciousness, you got to have the experience to get the concept. But once you have the concept, then I think the story is different.
So is that response that essentially you only have the concept with if you've had the experience? Then is that like the note? Okay,
exactly. So, and you know, I think that there's a real sense in which the pure phenomenal concept can only be had when the stuff is there. So, like for me, I think of myself as aphantasic. So I can't close my eyes and picture red. I just can't do it. But I see red all the time. And when I like I have these red scissors off screen here, and often I'll stare at them when I'm writing about this stuff and be like, the redness of red, and like the redness of red. So it's like I don't think you can really, like, when it's not, and since I can't just call it up in my mind, I can't, there's nothing for me to get a grip on unless the thing is there. And then you form the thought, this is what it's like, and this is capturing the phenomenal quality. And I don't think the aphantasia stuff has anything to do with like the quality. I can do it just as fine when the tomato's in my hand or the scissors are there. So it's still the question of, that's what it's like. So, you know, even though I'm kind of persuaded by transparency and stuff, and I have wondered if I wasn't aphantasic, would I still be influenced by transparency of consciousness and thinking of the qualities out there? I don't know. But anyway, I still think that all the same issues come up, and that Mary still learned something new. Even if she was aphantasic, she would still learn something new. I mean, aphantasic Mary might be an interesting case where she can like see the red, but then later she can't like picture it or image it in any way. And then would you say when she's like later that day, is she still knowing what it's like to see red if she's aphantasic? I would say no, not until she sees red again in a real, in a pure sense of the case that matters for the argument. Anyway, no, so there is a lot of things. I'm not saying, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not trying to come at you. I just thought
I agree. There's that my views are not. I'm not Mary. My views have room to be improved upon. So actually, I appreciate when people raise things that are like blind spots or things I've not considered, and it makes me grow my views and stuff. So I actually appreciate.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Well, I hear downstairs people are yelling for me, so let me let you go. But also let me say before I do that, you know, I don't know much about you. I've never met you in real life. This is the most interaction we've ever had. But like I mentioned before, I've seen some of your videos, and I know a little bit about your history, about how you started studying philosophy, and then I guess became disillusioned, and how before that you were a believer and were brainwashed by Jordan Peterson. So I've seen some of the things that you've done and seen your history. And I just want to say that I think you're doing a tremendous service for philosophy, actually, whether you're in school or out of school, whether you're formally studying this stuff or not. It's clear to me that you are a philosopher, and by which I mean someone who's deeply struck by these issues and wants to reason their way to a rational, self-justified conclusion, whatever that for you equilibrium turns out to be. And doing it in public, in front of other people, is courageous. And so I really think this kind of public philosophy that you're doing, whether in a university or not, whether you ever got back to college or not, this is real philosophy that you're doing. And so I hope that ultimately your intellectual curiosity, whether you think of yourself in this way as a philosopher or not, doesn't die out, and that this experience in academia, which I know can be crushing in many ways, hasn't extinguished that flame. So I'm glad to see that it's coming back. And I'm flattered that you thought of me as someone that you'd like to talk to. But I just think that these conversations you're doing are so very important amongst people like me, but also just the general conversations that you have. So I just want to say, I'm grateful for the content that you make, and that there are people like you that are doing it. So thanks.
Well, thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that's really nice to hear. So thank you. Anyway, I'll let you go and spend time with your family, away from thinking about these things. And, thanks.
Like my 8-year-old son says, consciousness is bad for you. So
and your channel for people who want to check it out. Do you want to one more brown, right?
Oh, the YouTube, yeah. Oh, I don't know the name of that. I think it's like One More Brown Philosophy or Richard Brown Philosophy, or if you just Googled my name, it would probably come up. But my blog, Philosophy Sucks. I also have a podcast, Consciousness Live. You could probably just search for that. It's mostly on YouTube nowadays, but sometimes it's also audio podcasted. But I guess I should know. I don't really know what my YouTube channel.
It's all right. Yeah, no problem. I'm sure people find it, and I'll link it in the description as well. So thanks.
Cool, but I'm open. People come and talk to me about this stuff. This is what I'm interested in. So I appreciate all viewpoints.
Yeah, no worries. So I'll end it there. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. See ya.